Betrayal in the Dark. It was a quiet night in late October. Maya was patrolling the empty streets of a small Texas town. The air carried a heavy, eerie stillness as the early morning hours approached. But that night, at around 2:15 a.m., the radio crackled to life. Maya received a call. Maya picked up the radio, and a woman's voice came through on the other end.
Police, please. I think there's someone in my house.
Maya could hear the woman's frantic, shallow breathing. But just as she was about to respond, the line went dead. She tried calling back, but it went straight to voicemail. Maya radioed a colleague to get the location. She stopped, squinting at her GPS. It was just a few blocks away, near the town's edge. Something about the woman's voice unsettled her, so she decided to check it out. Maya arrived at the location, but there was nothing, just an empty lot. The wind whistled softly, rustling through the tall, dry grass. She checked her GPS again. The location was correct, but there was no house, just emptiness. In the distance, a faint light flickered on the porch of an old farmhouse. Maya felt an odd pull toward it. She decided to walk to the farmhouse, thinking maybe they knew something. She parked and approached the door. Maya knocked, and after a few minutes, the door creaked open. A young man answered, looking tired, confused, and not at all like someone who had made a frantic emergency call.
"Can I help you, officer?"
he asked, squinting at Maya through the dim porch light. She explained the call, asking if he had seen or heard anything unusual. He shook his head, confusion plain on his face. She asked if he knew anyone else living nearby. The man slowly shook his head.
"No, there haven't been any houses for miles."
Maya thanked him and returned to her car, a deep unease settling in her stomach. Maya checked her radio again and tried calling the number one more time, but it still went straight to voicemail. She decided to head back to the station, but as Maya turned the key in the ignition, something caught her eye in the rearview mirror. Someone was sitting in the backseat. She could only see a faint silhouette, a hunched figure barely visible in the darkness. Maya's heart pounded as she tried to stay calm, reaching for her radio to call for backup. But before she could, a sharp blow struck the back of her head. Pain exploded. Her vision and everything around her faded into darkness. Maya woke up groggy, her head throbbing. Her hands were tied, and the air smelled of damp wood and rust. A single light bulb swung overhead, casting long, jagged shadows. Then, Maya saw her. It was her colleague, Jeff. Her face twisted into a manic grin, her eyes gleaming with cruelty.
You didn't expect to see me, did you? I've been waiting for this.
She continued, pacing with a gleaming knife in hand.
Do you know how long I had to smile? While everyone adored you, Maya.
While I was stuck dealing with scraps, she lunged, pressing the blade close to Maya's face, taunting her about always being so calm. She wanted to see just how calm Maya would stay now. The cuts weren't deep, but they stung. Blood trickled down Maya's skin as Jeff mocked her, savoring every moment. Maya waited, biding her time. Jeff's grip on the knife loosened slightly as she got lost in her own rage. When she leaned in too close, Maya struck. She kicked Jeff's shin with all her strength, making her stumble. Maya's hands were still tied, but she used her shoulder to slam Jeff into the wall. The knife clattered to the floor. Jeff was dazed, giving Maya just enough time to grab it.
I feel sorry for you, Jeff.
Then, Maya bolted. Behind her, Jeff staggered out, screaming Maya's name, but her voice grew fainter as Maya sprinted toward her patrol car. Maya stumbled into the police station, covered in blood but alive. Her colleagues rushed toward her, their faces a mix of shock and concern. Maya told them everything. Jeff was arrested. She sat calmly, as if nothing had happened, but her eyes still carried pure malice. A few weeks later, Maya drove past the place where it all began. But now, she understood. Sometimes the monsters we fear don't hide in the darkness. They stand right beside us, wearing friendly faces. The final trip. Chris was always aware of the risks that came with being an Uber driver, especially working late at night. But when you're struggling to provide for your family, risk is just part of survival. That night at 10:30 p.m., Chris accepted a ride request from a quiet suburban neighborhood. The passenger was a man named Calvin. When Chris arrived, he saw the man wearing a hoodie, avoiding eye contact. He hesitated for a second, but brushed off the unease. He had picked up hundreds of passengers before. That was his first big mistake. Calvin got into the car with barely a word, pulling his hood lower to obscure his face. Calvin said nothing, staring out the window, making Chris uneasy. He tried not to think too much about it and focused on the road. But as the road stretched on and the streetlights grew sparse, his anxiety deepened. They were heading toward a more isolated area. Suddenly, Calvin leaned forward and pressed something cold and hard against the back of his neck. It was a gun. He growled,
"Take the next exit, and don't ask any questions."
Chris's breathing grew rapid, his knuckles turning white against the steering wheel.
"I have kids,"
he stammered.
"Please, man, take whatever you want."
The car stopped in a deserted clearing. Calvin ordered Chris out. He shut off the phone and took the car keys. Desperation set in, but Chris refused to give up. The ground beneath him was wet and uneven. Cold sweat mixed with rain on his skin. Calvin pressed the gun into his back, motioning for him to walk toward the woods. At a clearing, he rifled through Chris's belongings, searching for anything valuable. He found some cash but grumbled that it wasn't enough before continuing to search. Chris saw his chance. With one swift motion, he pulled a can of pepper spray from his jacket pocket and sprayed it into Calvin's face. The man screamed in pain, stumbling backward and dropping the gun. Chris didn't hesitate, he ran as fast as he could. Branches tore at his skin, darkness making it impossible to see where he was going. But he didn't stop. It didn't matter anymore. Up ahead, Chris saw a light in the distance, a road, an escape. Behind him, Calvin had recovered.
"You think you can run from me?"
His voice echoed through the trees. Another mistake happened. Chris, too focused on looking back at his pursuer, tripped over a hidden rock and fell to the ground. Pain shot through his ankle. Before he could stand, Calvin grabbed his hair and yanked him back. Chris fought back, struggling against the grip.
"Please don't kill me. I've given you everything I have."
But instead, Calvin slammed him against a tree. Racked with pain and hopelessness, Chris collapsed, his vision blurring. He wished for anyone to save him, but maybe this was his chance to save himself. As Calvin gasped for air, rubbing his eyes from the earlier attack, Chris slowly, silently reached for a rock. Without a second thought, with every ounce of strength left in him, Chris swung the rock hard against Calvin's head. Blood trickled down his face as he staggered. Though his ankle was nearly twisted, Chris sprinted toward the light he had seen earlier. A narrow stream trickled through the forest, making him pause for a moment. Chris waded through the water, knowing the stream would mask his footsteps and movement. The pain in his ankle was nothing compared to the terror of what would happen if Calvin caught him. Crawling through the brush, his body ached, but his will to survive burned stronger than ever. When he reached the road, utterly exhausted, Chris burst out of the trees, waving his arms frantically.
"Help, please."
Headlights flooded the road, momentarily blinding him. A car screeched to a sudden stop. A woman immediately jumped out, rushing to his side and calling the police. That was the last thing Chris saw before his vision faded into exhaustion. Now safe, Chris was able to help authorities piece together the case against Calvin, leading to his arrest and trial. Despite his injuries, Chris was grateful he had survived. He would see his family again. The Graveyard Shift. 15 years. That's how long I've been working the night shift at this cemetery, a place filled only with darkness and heavy silence. My shift starts at 11 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m., during a time when the rest of the world is asleep. Over the years, I've seen a lot, mainly teenagers causing trouble, or the occasional group of drunk people, but tonight was different. The night started like any other. I arrived early, had a brief chat with the daytime worker before he left. Then, it was on to the usual routine, a quick check. My only job was to drive the golf cart around occasionally, making sure everything was in order. Nothing happened, and tonight, nothing seemed to be happening either. I drove around several times before heading back to the security room for a break, which was right inside the cemetery grounds. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take another lap. As I reached the end of the yard, the headlights of the golf cart swept across the fence, hidden in the darkness. That's when I saw him, a figure standing by the fence. At first, it was just a shadow. I drove closer. Now, I could see it was a man standing outside the fence. His features were barely visible, obscured by the shadows. He was standing still, looking towards me. I didn't want to confront him, not yet, so I decided to circle the parking lot, hoping he'd be gone when I returned. But when I came back, he was gone. A deep sense of unease began to settle in. I got out of the cart, slowly, scanning the area again to make sure he hadn't snuck in. But everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place. So I continued my patrol, passing through the entire yard, which took about 15 minutes. Sometimes I would slow down just to make the time go by faster. 15 minutes later, I got back in the cart and returned to the same spot. He was there again, but this time, he was inside the cemetery, standing on the gravel path. My heart raced as I drove closer, the gravel crunching under the tires. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, unnervingly still. I got out of the golf cart and started walking toward him. He looked like a man in his 40s, his clothes dirty and old. I stopped a few meters away from him and told him he wasn't allowed in here and that he should leave soon. I spoke, but he didn't respond or even turn his head to look at me. I reached out, intending to gently tap his shoulder, but the moment my hand touched him, he spun around to face me. His eyes filled with anger, and for a moment, I thought he might attack me. But instead, he turned and started walking, heading straight for the fence. I stood frozen, watching as he effortlessly walked through the fence and vanished into the darkness on the other side. Trembling, I got back in the golf cart and drove straight to the security office. I needed to calm down, to think. Once inside, I locked the door and tried to steady myself, trying to stay calm. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then there was a loud knock at the door. I jumped, my heart racing. Another knock followed, this time more forceful. Panic set in. I had nowhere to go. My mind raced as I grabbed the landline and dialed 911. I explained what was happening, my eyes fixed on the door. The knocking continued, relentless, until it suddenly stopped. The next day, I sat with my manager as we reviewed the CCTV footage. The grainy black and white video played on a small screen, showing the man I had seen the night before. What I saw was horrifying. Just minutes after I entered, the man I had seen in the yard walked to the door. He stood there, motionless, for almost 15 minutes before he began pounding on the door. In his hand, he held something, but the footage wasn't clear enough to tell what it was. It looked like a metal rod or pipe. He was never identified, and I haven't seen him again since that night, but the memory of that night still lingers with me. Every time I drive past the cemetery, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, hoping he never appears again. The Haunting of Route 23. I've been doing this job for over 20 years, driving on long, desolate highways at all hours. As a truck driver, I've gotten used to isolation, to the silence of the road. As a truck driver, I've also had to get used to sometimes sleeping in dangerous places. I was driving along Route 23, a road known for its long, deserted stretches. It's a 30-mile stretch of highway surrounded by endless rows of trees and dark tunnels. I had been driving for 3 hours, and I usually stopped for a break after 4. I didn't particularly like this road, but I had no other choice. I spotted a small parking lot up ahead, a flat patch of land nestled between the trees. It was just big enough for my truck. I turned in and parked there. The dense trees surrounded me with a sense of desolation and silence. I stepped outside to brush my teeth. While brushing, I heard the sound of an engine echoing in the distance. A car was approaching, but instead of passing by, it slowly crept closer. Its windows were dark, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. I hurried back to the safety of my truck, slamming the door shut. I wrapped the seatbelt around the handle, an old trucker's trick, to make it harder for anyone to open the door from the outside. I had done this many times before in dangerous places, but tonight, it felt necessary. I pulled the curtain shut and lay down on the bed in the back of the truck, covering myself with the blanket. But the fatigue from the long drive soon took over, and within minutes, I was fast asleep. It felt like I had just closed my eyes when a noise woke me up. It was footsteps, soft and slow, circling the truck. Then they stopped right outside the driver's door. Then came a loud, violent knock on the door. I jolted up, almost falling out of bed. The knocking on the door grew more frantic, more aggressive. My hands fumbled as I tried to shove my shoes on. I shouted, "Who's out there?" But there was no answer, just the banging getting louder. I rushed to the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I shoved the key into the ignition. The truck roared to life. I pulled the curtain aside, ready to drive off. And that's when I saw him. A man, dressed all in black, stood just inches from the truck. He held a large knife in one hand and a hammer in the other. We locked eyes, and he twisted his face into a grotesque, maniacal grin. He seemed unhinged. Then he lifted the knife in front of me, as if taunting and provoking me. My truck suddenly stalled. I hit the horn, warning him I would charge if he didn't back off. But instead of retreating, the man started walking toward me. He quickened his pace. Then he started sprinting toward me, yelling as he ran. The knife and hammer swung wildly in his hands as he charged at the truck. I realized my window was still cracked open. I reached to close it, but before I could, his face was pressed against the glass. His wild eyes stared into mine. He grinned, nodding toward the window. With a sudden swing, the hammer smashed against the driver's side window. The glass shook but held. My hands trembled as I tried to restart the engine. Another swing. This time, the glass shattered. A third swing. Cracks spiderwebbed across the window. It was about to give completely. My life hung by a thread. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas just as the window opened. The man screamed as the truck lunged forward, throwing him off balance. His hammer was still lodged in the broken window as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stand up. He stood in the middle of the road, watching as I drove away. His silhouette was clearly visible in the mirror. I haven't driven like that since. That night taught me to always be prepared, to plan my route down to the smallest detail. Now, I sleep in safer places, far from empty parking lots. Hide and seek in an abandoned house. Today, I decided to ignore my parents' warnings and meet up with my friends to play hide and seek in the old abandoned house near the woods. I remember everything clearly: the musty air, the creaking floors, and the thrill that washed over me as we sneaked into the dilapidated building. Jack, Rian, Lexi, and I. We loved adventure and the adrenaline rush, but nothing could compare to the mystery of that house. The house was surrounded by barbed wire, with the gate tightly locked, but we found a small hole in the wall, hidden behind overgrown grass, just big enough for us to crawl through one by one. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt something was off, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. We decided to play hide and seek. It was my turn to seek, so I closed my eyes and started counting. The others scattered throughout the house, laughing, their footsteps echoing through the empty rooms.
98, 99, 100.
I opened my eyes and immediately went searching for my friends. It didn't take long to find Lexi and Rian, but Jack was different. He was always better at hiding. I searched every nook and cranny, every room, until I caught a glimpse of a shadow darting by.
Got you, Jack.
I mumbled and ran after him. But something was strange. The shadow seemed faster, slipping around corners as if leading me on. My excitement turned into doubt and fear. No matter how close I thought I was, the shadow always evaded me, disappearing just as I was about to catch up. Not long after, Jack finally came out of the master bedroom, scratching his head. He apologized, saying he had hidden in the closet and fallen asleep. But my heart skipped a beat. Who had I been chasing? I gasped and told Jack and the others what had happened. They laughed, teasing me for trying to scare them. Determined to prove it, I convinced them to play again. We played again. I resumed searching, but soon that uneasy feeling returned. The house was too quiet, too still. My friends were nowhere to be found, and the more I searched, the more convinced I became that something terrible had happened. Then I saw it again. A hand reached out from behind a wall, waving at me from a distance. Suddenly, I noticed a pair of shoes on the ground, just like Lexi's. I called out, but she didn't answer. The hand waved at me again from afar. I moved closer, but as I approached, the hand disappeared. I chased after it, only to find another arm waving from the top of the stairs. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't find anyone. Then I saw a face that looked like Rian's in the window. He stood still, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I knew something was wrong. I pressed my face against the window to get a closer look, and it was a child, about our age, but with a wrinkled, aged face, eerie and twisted. His clothes were stained with red patches, and I froze when I saw him holding something, a long, rusted, sharp metal rod. Before I could move, he spoke in a chilling voice.
Oh, you found me. Now it's my turn.
He grinned widely, then began counting.
1, 2, 3.
Panic surged through me. I didn't take the steps one by one. I bolted down the stairs as fast as I could. His laughter echoed behind me. I remembered the secret closet Jack had hidden in earlier. In desperation, I dove inside, pulling the door shut and holding my breath as I listened. I didn't dare make a sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying he would leave. I must have passed out from lack of oxygen. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. It turned out my parents and the police had been searching for us all night, and my friends had managed to escape to alert them. Later, we found out that he was the escaped mental patient the police had been searching for. Because he was as short as a child, he had crawled through the hole in the back wall and turned the abandoned house into his temporary hideout. His favorite thing to do was play hide and seek with children, and then harm them in various ways. The most terrifying part, the police still haven't caught him. The night at the airport. Kevin was always a hardworking guy, juggling a daytime job and night shifts at the airport to earn extra money. Partly, it was convenient because he lived nearby, making the commute easy. It was Kevin's first night shift, The terminal was eerily quiet when he arrived around 1 a.m. The airport manager handed him a set of keys, saying he would return around 4 a.m.
Do you have a flashlight?
The manager asked. Kevin nodded, assuring him he did, and began his tasks, mopping the floors, inspecting restrooms, and ensuring no pipes were leaking. Everything was so quiet that he could hear the echo of his own footsteps. While wiping down the counters, he glanced out at the silent runway. It was a familiar sight, but tonight, something felt different. Then he heard a woman's laughter from somewhere far away. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the sound was too distinct to ignore.
Is anyone there?
Kevin called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. There was no reply. Suddenly, the sound changed. It was no longer laughter, but heavy footsteps coming from the restroom area. He assumed it might be a homeless person who had snuck in. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the hallway into darkness. He grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the source of the noise. The restroom was at the end of the terminal, and his unease grew with each step. He shone his flashlight into the room, but the only thing he saw was a woman with long black hair, standing with her back to him. He couldn't see her face because she was facing away.
Excuse me, ma'am. You can't be here.
Something was off. She seemed to vanish. He stepped closer, noting strangely that none of the stall doors were closed. Kevin waited a few seconds in the dark with his flashlight before deciding to check for himself. When he reached the last stall, the hair on his neck stood on end. There was no woman. Alone in the restroom, he splashed water on his face, trying to shake off the sleepiness and clear his head. Kevin went out to find the power switch to turn the lights back on, but he froze. On the floor he had just cleaned, there were now dark, blood-like footprints. Sweat began dripping down his forehead as fear took hold. He decided to call his manager, but when he pulled out his phone, there was no signal. The footprints led him to the far end of the airport, near a narrow hallway that descended into the basement. Just before Kevin reached the basement door, he heard something, a heavy, labored breathing. Someone was on the other side. From the darkness, he saw an eye, wide open, with a tiny black pupil staring at him through a crack. Kevin panicked, collapsing to the floor. He had never felt this kind of fear in his life. Suddenly, the eye blinked, and Kevin realized he was entirely alone in the airport. He remembered locking the doors after the manager left, meaning there was no way anyone else could have entered. So, who was on the other side of the door? Suddenly, a bony hand with skeletal fingers appeared through the crack and beckoned to Kevin. The terrifying eyeballs stared at him. The woman's laughter echoed once more, and then the basement door burst open. Kevin wanted nothing more than to stand and run as a spine-chilling scream erupted, shattering every glass window around him. Kevin shielded his face from the flying shards and began shouting for help. Then, a chilling gust of wind swept over him. He opened his eyes to see a terrifying woman staring directly at him, so close that Kevin could feel her icy breath on his skin. Her face was gaunt, with blood dripping from her head as she stared into him. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but only distorted moans escaped. Then everything faded to black. Later, he awoke to someone calling his name. Kevin found himself lying on the floor, with the manager helping him up. Looking around, everything seemed untouched. There were no footprints or broken doors. After leaving, Kevin learned he had passed out near the site where a woman had been assaulted by a dangerous man. The culprit had disguised himself as a janitor to hide in the airport. Perhaps Kevin's decision not to follow the ghost into the basement had saved his life. Nightmare with the delivery person. I am one of those people who hates ordering food over the phone. My kids always criticize me and call me old-fashioned because rain, thunder, or snow, whenever we order food, I always drive straight to the restaurant. What they don't know is that this isn't just a whim. It's a story that's not exactly a pleasant one. I was 12 years old, and it was one of the first times I was allowed to stay home alone. My parents had gone to a friend's party a few blocks away and decided I was old enough to take care of myself. I was thrilled because I could stay home alone and sleep whenever I wanted. That night, I was allowed to order a pizza by myself. At first, my parents waited for the delivery guy, but he was taking too long, so they had to leave. Seeing how excited I was, they left me some money and headed out. As soon as they left, I turned on the TV and cranked up the volume. I knew it would be a long night, so I took the dog out to the backyard. After my parents left, he finally arrived, very late. I heard the sound of a motorcycle stopping outside my house. I stood up and walked toward the door. Maybe the pizza guy had finally arrived. I opened the door and saw a tall, skinny man with a scruffy, bushy beard holding a pizza box. He looked at me with a strange, almost unsettling expression. At that moment, I was hungry and feeling a little uneasy, so I said,
You're late.
The man stared at me and said,
Hey kid, what's your problem?
I started to feel weird about his behavior. He seemed almost angry, and his body language became more aggressive. At that moment, I got scared and just wanted to avoid anything bad happening. I quickly handed him the money and grabbed the pizza box from his hands. I apologized and quickly closed the door. I was so scared I nearly slammed it shut. But it didn't stop there. Things got worse. He didn't leave but stood there, almost shouting through the front door.
Hey kid, what are you doing? I haven't even counted the money.
All the money is there.
I cried and apologized. At that point, I just begged him to leave and take all the money. There was silence for a moment, but then the man started yelling again, demanding a tip. He lost control, banging on the door with his fists and kicking it when I didn't respond. After a few seconds, just as suddenly as it started, he seemed to get bored and left. My first instinct was to slowly creep toward the door and peek out the nearby window to check if he was really gone. But as I did so, his face suddenly appeared right in front of me, twisted into a crooked smile, and in his hand, he was holding something. When I realized he was holding a baseball bat, I panicked, frantically hiding under the bed, hoping he wouldn't find me. Meanwhile, he pounded on the door with the baseball bat, and after a few strikes at the lock, the door burst open and he entered my house. He went straight to the wardrobe, where I almost hid, and began smashing it violently. If I had hidden there, my entire body would have been destroyed. He left the room and headed straight for the backyard, suspecting I might escape there. My dog immediately attacked him, but at that moment, I heard my dog whimper. I realized something had happened to him, and I couldn't hold back the overwhelming sadness. He moved like a shadow, storming toward where I was hiding, his face twisted in anger.
Where are you, kid? I know you're hiding somewhere.
He yanked the mattress away and began smashing the bed with the bat, as if trying to break the wood and leave me trapped beneath the wreckage. The wood of the bed began to splinter, and the shards dug into my skin. All I could do was scream for help. As if answering my prayers, two of my neighbors burst in from behind and tackled him to the floor. He quickly got back up, grabbing the bat and trying to swing at them, but one of the neighbors managed to wrestle it away. Then he fled immediately. Suddenly, everything went white and I passed out. When I woke up, I found myself in the hospital. My parents were crying in front of me, saying I was lucky to have only minor injuries. I accidentally overheard my parents talking about the man. He had been a convict with a history of violence, and that night, he had fought with a couple and argued with his boss. In the years that followed, I never ordered delivery again after what happened. The mysterious harmony from the ancient piano. Nee, a young woman in her early 20s, stepped into a small, dimly lit antique shop in a quiet neighborhood. The shop was cluttered with antiques, old books, worn furniture, dusty frames, and a few musical instruments scattered around. The air reeked of aged wood and forgotten memories. Nee walked past the counter where the shopkeeper stood. He stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes, as if he had been waiting. His face was gaunt, his skin pale. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was strange.
You found the piano. It's calling you. It will begin soon.
The word sent a chill down her spine since she hadn't mentioned the piano. The atmosphere grew odd. She decided to look around briefly and leave quickly. Then, Nee's gaze landed on a piano, old and tucked away in the corner of the shop. Despite its age, its darkened wood seemed to exude a mysterious allure. She brushed her fingers lightly over the keys. The instrument's delicate beauty starkly contrasted its eerie presence, making it irresistible. She approached the counter to face the man again. This time, she noticed his hands were marked with faint, dark scars, as if burned or clawed repeatedly, the lines deep and jagged. She decided to take the piano and leave. The door chimed behind her, and she turned to see the shopkeeper standing at the window, staring at her unblinkingly as she walked away. From the moment she placed it in her room, strange things began to happen. Nee began to play the piano softly, trying to familiarize herself with its peculiar presence. The keys, though old, worked, but felt strange beneath her fingers. Suddenly, Nee stopped playing. The music lingered in the air for a moment before dissolving into faint whispers. She stood, heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. One night, after a restless sleep, she returned to the piano. Nee found a yellowed sheet of music tucked among the piano strings. Curious yet uneasy, she played it, only to discover the notes resonated in an inexplicable way. It felt as though the notes were alive, playing themselves before her fingers touched the keys. Unintentionally, Nee had begun to unlock the tragic history of the piano's previous owner. She continued to play, unable to understand why she couldn't stop. She heard a faint voice whispering in her ear, speaking an ancient language. The words seemed to echo in her mind, filling her thoughts. She stood up abruptly, thinking she was probably too tired, and decided to head to her room and sleep. Nee drifted into slumber after a tense day. She was no longer in her room, but found herself in a grand concert hall. The room was empty, except for a grand piano at its center, and dim light from antique chandeliers that looked decades old. As Nee approached the piano, she saw a tall, gaunt man seated at the keys. He wore an old black suit, but his sunken eyes and pale skin made him look like a wax statue. Nee called out,
Who's there?
The man slowly turned around. His gaze pierced through Nee, and his voice echoed like a distant whisper.
I've waited a long time.
Nee tried to step back, but it felt like her feet were pinned to the floor. The man glided closer, not moving his legs, as if floating on air. Then the man pointed toward an old table nearby. On it lay a dusty sheet of music titled Sonata of Eternity.
There's not much time left. Only this melody can save us, or drown us both.
Before Nee could respond, the space around her twisted into a black vortex, engulfing her. She woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, clutching a corner of her blanket. Everything around her was silent. The dream not only left a haunting impression, but also led Nee to crucial details in reality. Perhaps she had unwittingly opened a door, allowing the spirits and tragic memories of the composer to resurface. She could still recall the image of the man struggling amidst the shadows, his eyes filled with despair, as if begging her to uncover the truth. She stopped playing the piano. For days, she couldn't bring herself to touch the instrument. Night after night, Nye heard whispers growing louder and more persistent, making everything feel increasingly unbearable.
Help me. Free me from the curse.
These words seemed to come from the trapped soul of the composer, still bound to the piano through his music. Waking in despair, Nye approached the piano, slowly sitting down. She noticed a small, faint mirror appearing behind the instrument. Nye cautiously wiped the dust from the mirror. Beneath the grime, the figure of a man slowly emerged. The gaunt man, his deep, dark eyes locked onto hers. He said nothing, but his gaze was intense, almost pleading, as if trying to convey something. After staring into the mirror, Nye saw words gradually appear on the glass. The crooked writing seemed as though someone was etching it from the other side. You have only one chance. Then his bony, emaciated hand reached out from the mirror, grasping toward her, begging for salvation. Understand the final rhythm before you play.
Please, help me. Save me.
A weight pressed against her chest before everything returned to normal. Nye realized she had to complete the sonata. The only way to break the curse was to finish the music she had started. She was plunged into despair and fear as she realized the price of freeing him. If she didn't play the final sonata, the curse would claim her as well. As Nye studied the sheet music, every note seemed distorted, warning her. It revealed the words, when the piano begins to play, you must finish the music before the light in the mirror fades. If not, the door will close forever. Nye swallowed hard, feeling the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Time was running out. It could happen at any moment. In her darkest hour, Nye sat before the piano, determined to break the curse. The clock struck midnight. The room was ice cold, and the music filled the air like an oppressive weight. Nye's fingers trembled as she began to play the sonata, the final piece in the composer's symphony of sorrow. But as she neared the final notes, Nye realized the sheet music was incomplete. A note had been erased, forcing her to rely on her intuition to finish the piece. She couldn't stop now. Then the mirror behind the piano shattered. Startled, she paused for half a second but couldn't stop. The gaunt figure of the man seemed to crack with the mirror, his eyes filled with despair.
Save me. Be careful. If you fail, you will take my place.
He cried out, his voice laced with agony. Nye played the final note, placing all her faith in her intuition. In the last moment of the sonata, the piano emitted a piercing sound. A brilliant light burst from the mirror, and she felt the entire room being drawn into the vortex. The man's figure vanished, and the room suddenly fell silent. In the ensuing silence, the figure in the mirror was gone, leaving behind a whispered,
"Thank you."
The room felt lighter, as if both their burdens had been lifted. When the light faded, Nye found herself sitting in her quiet room, all the strings of her instrument broken, and the mirror shattered. Exhausted, Nye collapsed on the piano. Perhaps everything was truly over, and fortunately, she had completed it. But deep down, Nye didn't know if she would ever truly escape the haunting melodies that had once drowned her. The eccentric person on the bus. The cold and quiet night in a small town. Bella often took the bus to get to her workplace. Every day, Bella waited at the same bus stop, quietly watching the world pass by while sipping her coffee. One evening, as usual, she waited for the bus to return home. But there was a man who caught her attention, sending a slight chill down her spine. A man in his 30s, disheveled hair, unshaven, boarded the bus after her. He sat a few rows behind her, but she could feel his eyes on her, though she didn't dare turn around. There was something strange about his presence. Every day on the bus, that man reappeared, always boarding right after her, and his strange behavior began. At first, he walked by and left behind a crude and eerie doll, saying, "This is for you," a gift, before quickly walking away. Bella found it odd and didn't pick it up, ignoring it and moving to another spot out of fear. Sometimes, he would mumble to himself in faint, incomprehensible whispers. Bella grew increasingly uncomfortable, but brushed it off, chalking it up to just an eccentric man. After all, he was just another bus passenger. As days passed without seeing him, she began to feel relieved, thinking she might have overreacted. One evening, Bella sat in her usual spot near the back of the bus. As the bus passed a stop, she saw a familiar figure. She froze, unable to believe her eyes. Then he boarded the bus. She avoided looking at him, pretending not to notice. She sighed in relief as he walked past, but her relief didn't last long as he doubled back and sat right next to her, despite plenty of empty seats around. She didn't dare move. He didn't look directly at Bella, but occasionally glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Then, suddenly, he turned his head toward her, locking eyes with her for a brief moment. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and hollow, sending chills down Bella's spine. At the next stop, he said nothing, simply placed a small piece of paper in her hand and got off the bus immediately, leaving her stunned. Throughout the ride, I didn't dare to open it. When I finally did, curiosity got the better of me. The note read, "I will follow you." Bella's heart raced as she hastily got off the bus. Bella hurriedly stepped off the bus and started walking faster, but then she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned around, no one was there. As soon as she entered her room, she locked all the doors and pulled the curtains tight, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But then, from the window, she saw his figure lurking at the edge of the road, watching her. She couldn't tell if it was real or just her imagination driven by fear. The next day, Bella took a different route to work, avoiding buses entirely. But paranoia crept in. She began to feel like someone resembling the man from the bus was watching her from alleys, observing her from afar. Then the nightmare struck. A cold hand grabbed her wrist. Startled, she turned around in shock to see him, the man who had been following her from the bus. He gripped her tightly and said in a chilling voice, "You don't need to be scared. I just want to make sure you're safe." Bella was too terrified to think, only desperate to escape. She screamed, "Let me go," but it didn't change anything. His eyes were locked onto hers, unblinking. Luckily, Bella had prepared for the worst. She pulled a can of pepper spray from her pocket and sprayed it into his face, leaving him writhing in pain and temporarily blinded. Terrified, she ran without looking back and collapsed at a small roadside diner nearby, seeking help. He was apprehended shortly after being reported. He confessed that his obsession with Bella stemmed from her uncanny resemblance to his late girlfriend, who had died in a bus accident he couldn't prevent. He was diagnosed with PTSD, and seeing Bella on the bus had triggered his obsession. The man was later admitted to a facility for treatment. Bella, though still haunted by the events, found solace in knowing that the man wasn't truly a threat, but a broken soul lost in his past. But after all, everything had finally come to an end. The intruder and courage. Nicky recalled when he was 9 years old, his parents adopted a dog, wanting him to grow up with a companion to help him learn boundaries and discipline, as well as have a playmate. The dog's name was Charlie, a golden retriever. One night, Nicky woke up past midnight and noticed that Charlie had jumped off the bed and was whining at the door. Nicky got up and went downstairs with Charlie. As he walked through the living room, he felt something pass by him that he couldn't even recognize. Nikki led Charlie out into the backyard and stood by the door, waiting for Charlie to quickly finish and come back inside. But when Charlie came back inside, he turned toward the garage door, walked over, and began sniffing intensely. Soon, Charlie's usual curiosity shifted to something else. He began whining, pacing, and scratching at the door more aggressively, finally looking back at Nikki. Nikki hesitated, but Charlie wouldn't stop. Finally, Nikki opened the door and turned on the light. When the lights came on, there was a man wearing a black mask and dressed in all black, trying to break into Nikki's dad's Mercedes. Beneath him was a black bag full of stolen items. The man turned, startled by the light. Charlie immediately began barking, his deep, ferocious growls echoing through the garage. Nikki screamed for his parents, but within moments, the man reacted quickly, rushing over to grab him and cover his mouth. Charlie barked even louder, his desperation clear as he tried to protect Nikki. "Quiet," the man hissed, dragging Nikki toward the car. Charlie lunged, but the man kicked him out the door, sending him sprawling to the ground. His whimpers filled Nikki with heartbreak. Then the thief threw Nikki hard to the ground, leaving him weak and powerless. He leaned down, threatening him to stay quiet or else. After a moment, Charlie was on the other side of the door, barking again. Meanwhile, the man turned his attention back to the car, using a metal tool to try and pry the lock. Nikki sat frozen, trembling as Charlie's relentless barking continued. Moments later, the door burst open, and Nikki's parents rushed in with Charlie. Nikki's father's face contorted with anger as he took in the scene. "Let my son go," he shouted. The man turned around, grabbed Nikki, and put him in a chokehold. Nikki's father froze, and his face shifted from anger to immediate panic. It wasn't clear why until Nikki realized there was a knife pressed against his neck. The man demanded his parents step back, hand over the car keys, and let him drive away, or else he'd hurt the boy. Nikki's mother tightly held onto Charlie's collar, trying to restrain him as the dog growled and struggled against her grip. "Get the keys," Nikki's father said, his voice tense with fear. Nikki's mother turned toward the house, but her grip on Charlie slipped. The dog broke free and charged toward Nikki. The thief removed the knife from Nikki's neck, and the boy instinctively knew he would point it at Charlie. Acting on instinct, Nikki grabbed the knife and pulled it toward himself, the blade slicing through his fingers in agonizing pain. Charlie lunged forward. His jaws tore through the man's pants and clamped tightly onto his leg, causing him to scream in pain. Nikki's father immediately charged at the thief, pulling Nikki and Charlie away from him. Before the thief could react, his protective instincts took over, and he pinned the intruder to the ground, knocking him unconscious. It wasn't until Nikki's mother intervened that everything finally settled. Nikki could barely recall what happened next. All he knew was that the thief spent a long time in the hospital before being taken into custody. Nikki was also relieved that everyone, including Charlie, escaped without serious injury. Even though Charlie was older, he had proven his boundless love and loyalty to Nikki and the family. The shadow of the truth of school. Everything began when rumors spread across the school about a series of students mysteriously disappearing. The administration remained silent, with no official statements, but whispers filled the hallways. Lena was a quiet, diligent student who often immersed herself in schoolwork. She loved solving puzzles, seeking answers to difficult questions, and spending hours reading books. Some people said the students had run away. Others believed something darker was happening. Lena noticed the growing number of empty seats in her class, the somber faces of teachers, and the whispered conversations among students created a heavy atmosphere, and a sense of unease loomed over the school. Lena, always logical, dismissed the idea of anything supernatural or strange. But when Anna, a classmate she'd known for years, vanished without a trace. Lena became increasingly curious. Anna was supposed to meet Lena at the library, but she never showed up. The next day, Lena discovered Anna had joined the list of missing students with no explanation. She started piecing together the timeline of the disappearances, observing the dates and times when students went missing. It was always the same. They disappeared after a specific time, during the late hours of night school, after extracurricular activities had ended. Lena's curiosity led her to the school library, where she found old newspapers describing similar cases from years ago. She discovered an old yearbook featuring photos of students who had been part of a club years ago. Strangely, many of those photos were now listed as missing in old newspaper articles. One evening, as she stayed late studying, she heard faint noises from the hallway. Curious, she peeked outside and saw a woman with long blonde hair running past. Strangely, she didn't recognize the woman, and the timing seemed odd for someone to be running around the school building. Curious and uneasy, Lena decided to follow her. She trailed the blonde woman through the dark hallways of the school, staying out of sight. The woman's behavior was erratic. She seemed scared and confused, as if fleeing from something. The woman ran toward a man. He was tall and well-dressed, but something about her demeanor compelled Lena to follow. It was unusual, almost fearful. Lena decided to follow the man. She watched them leave the building, heading toward a secluded area near the school. The two entered an abandoned building, and for a moment, Lena hesitated. She followed them into the eerie darkness of the building, but just as she was about to step inside, she heard the woman's scream echoing through the night. Lena froze in place. It was too late to turn back. She cautiously stepped into the dark hallway of the building, the cries from afar growing louder. She moved toward a faint light at the end of the hallway, emanating from a slightly ajar room. As Lena approached, she could see photos on the walls, featuring blonde-haired girls. The names of the girls were written beneath their photos, but one name made her freeze in her tracks: Anna. She was stunned to see her own photo, following that of the girl she had just seen. Lena scanned the room and saw two blonde-haired girls, and to her horror, one of them was Anna. Both girls were emaciated, their hair crudely chopped. And then, he began to approach. Lena quickly backed away as she heard the man's voice. Anna's voice echoed in the room.
Jack, please forgive me.
She pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. Lena suddenly realized that this Jack was far from ordinary, and he was not someone she should confront. She needed to stay calm and avoid drawing attention. She decided to quietly leave. She left the abandoned building, found a safe spot, and quietly called the police. In the end, the truth came to light, and Jack was arrested. Investigations revealed that Jack had a troubled past. He was once a boy who was rejected by a blonde girl he loved. Jack was an unassuming, chubby boy with an unremarkable appearance. He confessed his love to a blonde girl, but she mocked him as fat in front of everyone and rejected his feelings. After years of bullying and humiliation, especially that public rejection, his anger grew. His hatred festered. And now, whenever he saw blonde-haired girls, he loathed them, regardless of who they were. He imprisoned them, cut their hair, and starved them into frailty. Lena felt fortunate to have uncovered the truth early and lucky that she was not the next victim, along with those who came after. Message on the mirror. Lily was living in an old apartment, a temporary home. The unique feature of the apartment was the mirrors. They reflected every corner of the space. Some were framed with antique designs, while others appeared worn and aged. Although Lily found them beautiful, they sometimes exuded a strange, unsettling feeling. Lily sat on the couch, reading a book. The apartment was enveloped in silence. Suddenly, Lily stopped. She heard footsteps. She sat still, listening. The sound continued, but when she looked around the room, No one was there. She shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Lily got up and glanced at the mirrors along the hallway. In the dim light, each mirror reflected her image, but with a strange distortion. A slight chill ran down her spine, but she ignored it. Lily stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The overhead light flickered as she washed her face, but she stopped when she saw something strange in the reflection. There was a shadow, resembling a man, pressed against the window. His face was obscured, but the outline of his body was unmistakable. Lily quickly turned around, but the bathroom was empty. A wave of fear washed over her. The unsettling feeling grew stronger. At night, she felt she wasn't alone, as if someone was standing just outside her line of sight, watching her. One night, just before bed, she went to the living room to watch TV. Then the feeling returned. She was tense, filled with fear, unsure if she was imagining it. But she saw it, a hand sliding past the curtain. Lily cautiously stood up and turned to look. The curtain swayed, but there was nothing behind it. Her breathing quickened, and a cold, heavy sensation filled the room. Then suddenly, from behind her, a shadow emerged from the darkness. It was unmistakably the figure of a man. He wore filthy, tattered clothes, his face gaunt and pale. He said nothing, only stared at Lily as if waiting for her to act. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move toward the door. Lily ran down the hallway. She reached the front door, fumbling with the lock. She glanced back to see the man's eyes, filled with amusement, a satisfied smile on his face as he watched her every move. She struggled to open the door, bursting out into the night, gasping for air. Her legs gave out as she stumbled down the stairs. She stood at the building's entrance, breathing heavily, asking for help from those around. They helped her call the police. The police arrived within minutes and stormed into the apartment. She told them about the man, about what she had seen inside, but they seemed skeptical. Everything in the apartment was untouched, and nothing was missing. There were no signs of forced entry. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The red and blue lights of the police cars flashed across the old building, leaving her alone once again. Lily stood outside, unable to bring herself to go back inside. She looked up at her apartment window, and for a moment, she thought she saw a faint figure standing there, watching her from behind the glass. She shivered, knowing she couldn't stay there any longer. It was time to pack up and leave for good. A few days later, she returned to the house. Lily stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath. She was here one last time to gather her belongings before leaving this strange place forever. Message on the mirror. The hallway seemed darker than before. The dim lights flickered weakly as she walked down the narrow corridor, her footsteps echoing faintly. Lily paused for a moment before the door, hesitating as her hand hovered over the doorknob. Then she slowly opened the door and stepped inside. The familiar chill hit her as she entered the apartment. She was ready to leave this place behind. As she walked through the living room, she caught a glimpse of herself in one of the mirrors. Her reflection looked almost unfamiliar, distorted by the unease she felt. Lily looked away, trying to focus on packing her belongings. Walking down the hallway, she came across an old mirror covered in dust, one she had never noticed before. It sat at the end of the hallway, almost forgotten beneath its dusty covering. She moved closer to the mirror. It was coated with a thick layer of dust, but something about it drew her attention. Slowly, she pulled the cloth away. She shuddered at what she saw. Written faintly in the dust on the mirror were the words, "Hello," and just below it, "I like you." Lily held her breath as she stared at the mirror. Had it always been there? She tried to reason with herself, convincing herself. It must have been there for a long time. She shook her head, trying to ignore the growing paranoia. Lily went into the bedroom, hastily gathering her belongings to pack and leave. As she passed the bathroom, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She stopped, slowly turning her head to look inside. Lily's heart skipped a beat. The bathroom sink faucet was running. She was certain she hadn't left it on. She cautiously stepped into the bathroom, her eyes fixed on the mirror. A message appeared on the fogged glass. "You are mine." Lily froze in terror. She had heard horror stories about people secretly living in others' homes. Was she unknowingly a victim? Trembling, she reached out to turn off the faucet. Slowly, she extended her hand and touched the surface of the mirror. She was shocked to feel a small latch, and the mirror suddenly moved, swinging open like a door. Lily staggered backward as the mirror revealed a hidden space behind it, larger and darker than she could have ever imagined. Then her heart nearly stopped. A face emerged from the darkness. It was a man, his hair disheveled, his wide eyes and a toothy grin, the shadows seemingly swallowing his body, making him appear as just a floating head. Below, the floor was cluttered with clothes, various trash, and some personal belongings. Panic surged through her. Lily turned, grabbed her keys, and bolted out of the bathroom. Lily burst through the front door of the building. She ran to her car, slammed the door shut, locked it, and called the police. The police arrived quickly. The man was eventually caught, still wearing that unnerving, unnatural smile. The police searched the apartment. They discovered a hidden space behind the bathroom mirror containing personal items, canned food, and things Lily recognized as her own. The man had been living there, watching her, moving around the apartment whenever she was out. When they apprehended him, he refused to explain or answer any questions from the police, sometimes sulking, other times aggressive, appearing mentally unstable. Lily felt incredibly lucky that the man was merely an agitated intruder and not a murderer. Otherwise, things could have been far worse. She started the car, glancing at the apartment one last time. Then she drove away, leaving the apartment and its horrors behind. The darkness from the Myers house. I used to work for DoorDash a few years ago, wandering through the maze of New York City at midnight to earn a few extra bucks. Tonight was no different, but it turned out to be my last delivery, a job that haunted me long after I left. GPS led me to an unfamiliar part of the city, dark and alien. My destination was an old, rundown fast food joint I'd never seen before. A man came out of the kitchen holding a package. It was red, like rotting meat, and I seriously doubted the hygiene and quality of their food. Handing me the package, the man said it was to be delivered to a place called the Myers house. The old man looked at me with hollow eyes and said to deliver it just before midnight, not to knock, just to leave it at the door. Confused, I asked if I should notify the customer. The man's face darkened. "You don't want to disturb Mrs. Myers. Trust me, it's for your own good and safety." His words lingered as I left. Something felt very wrong about this delivery, and I couldn't help but dwell on the strangeness of it all. In the drizzling rain, GPS led me down an abandoned road, miles away from any familiar part of the city. Soon, a shape emerged in the mist, the Myers house. The building loomed before me, old and decrepit, with boarded-up windows. I checked the address again. It matched. A dim light flickered on the porch, but there was no doorbell. I hesitated, then knocked on the heavy old door. The sound echoed in the silence, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder, and the door creaked open just enough to reveal a face. A pale woman appeared in the gap. She whispered, "Didn't he tell you not to knock?" I stammered an apology, then made an excuse. It's so dark, and I didn't want to leave the food outside." She gave a strange smile, her bony fingers brushing against mine as she took the package. They were icy cold, the chill seeping into my bones. At that moment, a loud clap of thunder boomed outside, and rain began pouring down. I groaned at the thought of heading back out into the storm. She looked at me. "You can wait here. Perhaps a cup of tea while you warm yourself? Exhausted and soaked, it being my last shift, I figured it wouldn't hurt. So, I stepped inside. I followed her inside, surprised by the stark contrast to the exterior. A large stone fireplace cast a warm glow across the luxurious living room. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor and offered me tea. I sat down, feeling a bit uneasy. She began offering me dessert, but I declined. Then her expression shifted. Eleanor's smile grew dark and menacing. Suddenly, something gleamed, a butcher knife in her hand. I froze, realizing the hunger burning in Eleanor's eyes. Panic overtook me. My head spun as I tried to stand, but my legs felt leaden, my movements sluggish. I could barely lift my arms. I forced myself to stand, reaching for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a brass candlestick. As Eleanor lunged, staggering, I swung with all the strength I had left. The candlestick connected with a sickening crack, sending her sprawling to the floor. Her bony fingers clawed at the carpet, dragging her broken body toward me, the hunger in her eyes burning brighter. Taking advantage of the brief respite, I staggered toward the front door, fumbling for the handle. With desperate strength, I yanked the door open. I didn't look back as I ran into the storm. I kept running until I saw and flagged down a passing car, collapsing onto the wet sidewalk. The last thing I saw was a stranger's worried face as I blacked out. I woke up in a hospital room and was told I had been drugged with sedatives. Even more shocking was that the restaurant where I had picked up Eleanor's order had vanished. It didn't exist on GPS. I can't help but think there are still hidden restaurants scattered across the city, secretly catering to the midnight cravings of cannibals I'll never understand. The madman at the cinema. On a cold evening, Beth stood in the staff room, scrolling through her phone as the night shift neared its end. It was a late shift, one of those nights that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a small, slightly run-down cinema with just one screen. Snow was falling heavier outside, and she was eager to get home after a long night of cleaning. As she texted her mother to let her know she was okay, the door creaked open, and her manager, Mr. Miller, walked in. Mr. Miller spoke in his usual tone.
Don't forget to lock the back door after you're done. I'll have William pick up the keys for tomorrow's shift. Also, check if the toilet's leaking before you leave.
Beth sighed, not thrilled about the last-minute request. She nodded and bid her manager goodbye before he left her to finish her tasks. Beth worked as part of the cleaning crew, but the cinema felt eerily empty after the final screening ended. As Beth walked down the rows of seats, sweeping up popcorn and other debris, a chill ran down her spine. Something about the atmosphere tonight felt different, though she couldn't put her finger on it. Beth's phone buzzed, and she picked it up. It was her mom, worried about her working the night shift again, and saying it wasn't safe. Beth began reassuring her. Beth hung up. With a sigh, she turned on some music on her phone and placed it on one of the red seats in the theater as she continued cleaning. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a faint sound, almost like glass shattering. It came from the emergency exit. Beth called out,
"Who's there?"
but no one answered. She stopped the music and started toward the emergency exit, which opened to reveal a long hallway with flickering lights.
"Is anyone out there? Hello?"
She continued walking, then froze in front of a shattered window. Glass lay scattered on the floor, along with a large rock that someone had likely thrown from outside. She wasn't alone. Beth instinctively reached into her pocket for her phone, but then she remembered it was still on the seat in the theater. She hesitated. Should she go back for it? But things were becoming more complicated. Without wasting another second, Beth hurried back to the theater. As she rounded the corner, Beth froze. Standing at the end of the hallway was a shadowy figure. He had his back to her, swaying unnaturally. like someone who had lost control. His clothes were disheveled, and his hair was a mess. Beth tried to quietly sneak away, but then he turned around, her stomach sinking as she froze in place. The light illuminated his horrifying face. He wore a sinister grin, like a grotesque mask, a mix of burns and hollow, bloodshot, crazed eyes. As she faced him, he revealed his dark intentions, saying,
I've been waiting for you. I will have you.
Beth stumbled back toward the theater as the man began chasing her, laughing and running like a madman. When she reached the seat where her phone lay, she grabbed it and ran deeper into the theater, hiding behind the rows of seats. Her hand reached for a mop nearby, ready to defend herself. Beth tried to call the police, but before she could speak, the emergency exit door burst open, and the man lunged in with a chilling, raspy laugh. She dared not breathe or move, but then she felt breathing above her head, freezing her in place. He suddenly appeared behind the seat, laughing in amusement.
You can't hide forever, Beth. I can hear your little heart racing.
Terrified, Beth ran, instinctively grabbing anything she could and hurling it at him to slow him down, throwing him off balance. Beth quietly crawled under the seats, making her way toward the exit. She was almost there and bolted for the door, but he noticed her movement at the last second and lunged at her. His icy hand grabbed Beth's hair. He yanked her back violently, causing her immense pain. Beth screamed, kicking with all her strength. Desperation surged within her as she grabbed a sharp piece of debris. She stabbed his hand, leaving a deep gash. He howled in pain, letting her go just long enough for Beth to get up and run toward the exit. She slammed the door shut, locking it and blocking it with a stick, despite his screams and pounding.
I'll be back. I'll find you.
She ran outside, barely noticing the cold, trembling as she called for help. Later, the police revealed that the man had been stalking Beth for weeks, even poisoning her cat to cause her grief. Beth was horrified. She had never known the man, but he had inserted himself into her life without her knowledge for a long time. Beth survived, but her life was forever changed. She was in shock, undergoing therapy, and eventually moved in with her sister. Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school, but as I walked home, the excitement of Friday lightened my mood. No school tomorrow. I could finally relax. As I approached my house, I noticed something odd. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left earlier that day for a business trip, so he must have been in a hurry and forgot to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I stepped into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut. The quiet of the house greeted me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the entire place to myself made me feel free. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, so I was all set for a night of gaming and movies. Hours passed as I got lost in my game. The house was silent, except for the occasional sounds from the TV. I decided to grab a drink, and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The garage light was on again. I froze, a strange, eerie feeling creeping over me. Did I forget to turn it off? Or had my mom come back? But I didn't hear her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my steps growing heavier. The moment I stepped into the garage, I saw that every drawer in my dad's workshop area was open. His tools were scattered across the floor, as if someone had been frantically searching for something. But no one was there. I hurried back inside, locking the garage door behind me. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I started heading back to the living room, planning to watch TV and try to calm myself down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattling violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder and harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was eerie, too silent. I ran straight for the front door, my only thought being to escape. But as I entered the living room, I froze in my tracks. Someone was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped an axe tightly. It must have been taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified that he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going upstairs was not an option. I quietly turned back and headed for the back door, trying to stay calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried across to my neighbor's house. Panicked, I banged on their door until they let me in. I waited there, staring at my house from across the street, praying the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I pounded on my neighbor's door, and it felt like hours before Mr. Thompson finally opened it, his face etched with confusion. I told him everything that had happened. Mr. Thompson, a retired firefighter with a strong sense of duty, grabbed a flashlight and an old baseball bat. He assured me he would check the house and that everything would be fine. Reluctantly, I stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body was still shaking with fear. My anxiety grew as I watched, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, wielding my dad's axe, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, shining his flashlight across the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside. From across the street, his voice echoed faintly. "There's no one in there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I knew I still needed to stay cautious. As Mr. Thompson began walking back toward me, that gnawing sense of unease returned. Before I could voice my concern, a shadow moved behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the dark side of the house, the axe glinting faintly under the porch light. I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned, the man lunged at him. A fierce struggle broke out. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe coming dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear, as I watched the horrifying scene unfold. Each second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson managed a strong swing with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder roared in pain, but instead of retreating, he raised the axe, ready to strike. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson threw himself to the side, narrowly dodging the blow. In that brief moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson delivered another blow, knocking the man off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help, but before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens echoed in the air. He looked up at the sound of the sirens and, using his last ounce of strength, bolted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, gasping for air but still steady. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they subdued him. The man thrashed violently, growling like a wild animal, but the police swiftly restrained him, pinning him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the entire scene unfold. Mr. Thompson approached me, clutching his side where he had been hit, but still managing a smile. "It's safe now," he said. I felt an overwhelming gratitude for being saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted was to forget. I sat down on the steps of Mr. Thompson's porch, my body trembling, watching the man sitting in the back of the police car as it drove away. It was over. but the image of the intruder's face, his crazed eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would stay with me. I would never forget how close I came to being caught in the grip of something truly evil. Rain pounded against the windshield as I drove down a deserted highway, my headlights barely piercing through the torrential downpour. I was a solitary traveler, accustomed to nights like this, navigating strange roads in search of new experiences. As I saw a sign emerge from the darkness, "Welcome to Cottage City," a wave of relief washed over me. Shelter was near. I pressed on, hoping the town would offer some respite from the storm. I drove slowly through the quiet streets. The town felt almost frozen in time. One house caught my eye, a crumbling structure by the roadside, abandoned and eerie. The walls were spray, painted with words like "Keep Out, Demon," and "Don't Look Back." Wooden crosses were haphazardly nailed to the porch and gate, as if someone was trying to ward off something within. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over and stepped out into the rain, turning on my flashlight. I stood outside, the light catching the faded words, and when I shone the beam toward the house, I froze. In the upstairs window, a boy stood staring down at me. His face was pale, with dark circles under his red, swollen eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. He didn't move, just gazed at me with an empty stare. I shivered and called out, "Hey, are you here alone, boy? Do you need help?" I mentioned that I was looking for a place to stay. The boy tilted his head, his expression unchanged, but his gaze seemed to pierce through me, questioning why I was there and suggesting I shouldn't be in this place. He began to speak. "Are you here to meet her?" It was an odd question, one that filled me with dread. I thought this place was abandoned. I asked why he was here alone and where she was. Then, inexplicably, he broke into a strange smile and told me, "Her? She's waiting for a replacement." His gaze shifted to something behind me, his expression turning to one of horror. A strong wind blew through, rattling the doors of the old house. Then suddenly, a hand touched me from behind. I turned around to see a creepy old man standing behind me with a lantern, his bewildered face wondering why I was standing in front of this abandoned house. I stammered, explaining that I was just a traveler, seeking shelter from the storm. I told him about the boy I had seen in the window, but he insisted that I must have imagined it, even though I knew what I had seen. I learned that the nearest hotel was still an hour's drive away, and he told me that if I wanted, I could stay overnight at his house. He made me feel strange, yet I accepted his invitation. It was hard to fathom that the boy I had seen in the abandoned house was just my imagination, but something told me this man knew more than he let on. The old man's house looked as ancient as its exterior. The furniture was old, the walls covered with dusty bookshelves and faded photographs. He led me to a seat by the fireplace. Finally, I mustered the courage to ask him about the house. He told me that many years ago, he moved here with his father. There weren't many children in the neighborhood, so he quickly made friends with a boy named Roland. Roland's family was large and boisterous, always filled with laughter. Roland's aunt, a warm woman, always had candy for the children, especially for him. But one day, she passed away suddenly. The whole family was grief-stricken, everyone except Roland. He didn't shed a single tear, didn't say a word. He just stood at her funeral, frozen and silent, his eyes vacant even as they lowered her into the ground. He had changed since that day, hardly going outside and spending hours alone in his room. Ronald was always in his room with his Ouija board. He used to say his aunt had taught him to use it, and Ronald would sit for hours trying to communicate with her. As he continued his story, I could almost visualize the events unfolding. Something had shifted in him that day, something dark and frightening. Then he continued telling me about what the boy had gone through since that day. Right after his aunt passed away, frightening things started happening in that house. At midnight, Roland's mother began hearing strange noises coming from his room at night, scratching sounds, like fingernails scraping the walls. Roland lay awake, eyes wide open, staring at something in the darkness. He felt a presence, something lurking beside his bed, watching him. Henry leaned forward. He told me how Roland had confided in his older friend, saying he felt eyes watching him every night as it stood at the edge of his bed, silent but terrifying. The next morning, Roland's mother checked his bed and found scratch marks on the mattress. And more than that, his mother found them on Roland's own skin. Roland would scream, sometimes laugh loudly in the middle of the night. His voice changed, becoming rough, distorted, and pained. Roland's mother would rush in, only to find him alone, trembling, his eyes filled with fear. He told her about them, strange, shadowy figures. They all gathered around his bed, staring with their hollow mouths open in a silent scream. They all thought Roland was different. Everyone knew something was invading him, but no one could stop it or help him. I shuddered as the old man recounted the family's desperate decision to call for an exorcism. Roland's family called in priests to perform an exorcism. Father Raymond was among them, placing a cross under Roland's pillow, hoping to drive out whatever haunted the house. The ritual began, Latin whispers filling the room. The exorcism became chaotic. Roland writhed on the bed, growling like an animal as if the cross caused him unbearable pain. Furniture flew across the room, and the cross seemed to burn him, driving him into a violent rage. Latin phrases poured from his mouth, mixed with a raspy laugh. His body twisted in unnatural ways, his eyes staring at something invisible. Father Raymond performed many exorcisms on Roland, and he endured immense pain. During the exorcisms, he would roll and vomit, spit, speak in Latin, then laugh uncontrollably. His voice was like a demon from the depths. Once, during an exorcism, Roland suddenly broke free from the priest's grip and lunged at the metal bed frame. He swung it wildly, striking a priest's arm, forcing them to halt the exorcism. On the night of the final exorcism, words appeared on Roland's body as if someone invisible was carving them with a sharp knife. On the final night, 3 priests performed Roland's last exorcism, even witnessing his body levitating. When they recited the final incantation, Roland's body fell motionless onto the bed. Everyone believed he was cured. Roland's family moved away soon after, and no one ever saw him again. Neighbors avoided the house, cursing it. Some families even moved away due to strange occurrences. He told me that some believe Roland's spirit never left, that he's still trapped in that house. I shuddered, recalling the boy in the window grinning at me, his eyes dark and hollow. I told the old man what I'd seen. Hesitating, as I said the boy looked no older than 14. The old man nodded slowly, saying that was Roland's exact age when he vanished. I was stunned by what I'd heard. The old man pointed to a small room under the stairs, suggesting I sleep there. He warned me again to stay away from the exorcised house, then went upstairs. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, wide awake, unable to shake the image of the boy from my mind. I wondered what would have happened if he hadn't come. Could I have been the next, just as the boy had said? The sun finally rose, and the memory of the night clung to me like a shadow. I thanked Henry and left, but the questions remained. Did Roland die during the exorcism? His soul trapped forever, or had something darker consumed him? But one thing was certain, I would never return to Cottage City again. Strange man in the cemetery. This summer, my family decided to go camping in a suburban village. a place where every corner seemed to hold a mysterious story. The locals were always whispering, especially about the nearby forest. But what intrigued me the most was the cemetery within the forest. No one had ever gone there after dark. We were not allowed to go there either. My cousin had the idea to play hide and seek at night. He liked to break boundaries, challenging all of us to venture into the forbidden forest. I went with my younger sister, who was only 10 at the time, and my cousin. He confidently decided to help us hide. I should have known it was a bad idea the moment he mentioned the cemetery. We crept through the forest, the leaves crunching underfoot. The closer we got to the cemetery, the colder the air became. Even the stray dogs that had been barking earlier were now completely silent. A sense of fear and unease flooded over me. My little sister held my hand tightly. But then, in the eerie silence, a sound pierced the air, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up, the unmistakable sound of digging. Out of the darkness, we saw him, a disheveled old man in filthy clothes, hunched over a grave. He was digging with his bare hands, muttering something incomprehensible. My eyes followed his hand. I saw something pale, like a stiff hand, sticking out of the freshly dug earth. None of us dared to move for a moment. My cousin was the first to act. He slowly pulled us back, whispering that we had to leave, that we needed to move silently. The man bent down again, this time pulling away more earth, revealing more of an arm, a foot, a body. Then he dragged out several small plastic bags and laid them on the ground. My sister trembled, and we were slowly sneaking away. Then I accidentally stepped on a branch. My heart skipped a beat, knowing that sound might give us away. He slowly raised his head, turned to us, and said,
"You shouldn't be here."
Then he stared at us and gave a slow, creepy smile as if he had lost his mind. The man laughed maniacally, wiping his dirty hands on his pants. Then he took a step forward, his bare feet dragging across the ground.
"You kids want to know what's down here?"
Before I could react, my cousin scooped up my sister, pulling her into his arms. The man's voice taunted us, as if daring us.
"See what they're hiding in the ground."
I stumbled, frozen. My cousin yanked on my arm, snapping me back to reality. He yelled, "Run!" and we bolted away from the cemetery. I ran as if my life depended on it. I could hear him behind us, his feet scraping on the gravel, his wheezing breath growing closer. I didn't dare stop. My cousin pulled us forward, his grip tight, until we reached the cemetery gate. We burst through the gate. For some reason, the man had stopped. He was no longer chasing us. He didn't follow, just stood there, watching. Then, as if he had never been there, he turned around and disappeared into the darkness of the cemetery. We returned to the campsite. No one said a word or mentioned what had happened. The next day, we found out that the old man had been arrested by the police. He was a deranged criminal who had been desecrating graves to smuggle drugs across the border. That night, we felt truly lucky. I still wonder what would have happened if he had been younger, stronger, faster. We never went near that forest again and reminded ourselves never to ignore warnings and restrictions again. The Deadly Neighbor. My family and I moved into a house in the suburbs, and the neighbors seemed friendly until I met Mara. She happened to be the neighbor next door, and my mom quickly befriended her. At first, she seemed kind and friendly, often visiting my mom for coffee chats, but there was something unsettling about her. One afternoon, Mara visited us. She and my mom were chatting on the balcony, and I don't know why I was there. Probably out of boredom, but I sat with them. Before my mom stood up to get a cake she had just baked, I was still sitting at the table with Mara, and that's when my life might have changed forever. Mara was a ghostly-looking woman, thin with long black hair and unnaturally large yellow eyes. Her eyes were so unnatural that maintaining eye contact for more than 3 seconds felt impossible. We sat in silence until she suddenly turned toward me, a creepy smile spreading across her face. She began tilting her head slowly from side to side, almost like a puppet, and then said, "Are you ready to go now, little one?" I froze in place. Her voice had changed significantly. There was something darker about it. She began pulling out a black rose from her purse, an odd-looking flower, and held it out toward me. It was the first time I'd ever seen a black rose, and I started sweating from fear. Before I could react, my mom returned with a tray of cake, and Mara suddenly reverted to normal, as if someone flipped a switch. She quietly placed the black rose back into her purse, her face expressionless, and my mom didn't notice. I left the balcony, trying to dismiss the encounter, but something inside me knew that she was no ordinary neighbor. At night, my room was on the ground floor, and my window was high up. To be honest, I was never an easily frightened kid, but that night, I didn't know why, a strange feeling flooded my mind. I kept tossing and turning, nervously checking and peeking out the window every 5 minutes. Finally, as I began to drift off, I decided to look out the window one last time to ease my mind. But to my horror, Mara was standing at my window, the faint moonlight illuminating her smudged, grinning lips, just like the eerie smile I had seen on her face earlier that afternoon. I began walking toward the door with trembling legs, sweat pouring down like rain. As I kept moving, Mara's sinister yellow eyes followed me in slow, puppet-like motions. I reached for the doorknob, but then she raised the black rose again and muttered those eerie words. "I hope you're ready now." I screamed, "Please leave me alone." The moment I said that, her smile disappeared, replaced by an angry scowl as she shook her head side to side in disapproval. Then the worst happened. Mara was trying to get inside. She gripped the window frame and began slamming herself against it with both hands. Horrified, I watched as the window slid open, and she began pushing her head through the gap. Mara's body twisted unnaturally, like a puppet manipulated by invisible strings. Panicking, I grabbed the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck. I couldn't open the door. She was almost inside. I heard her laughter, a sound that sent terror coursing through my veins. "You will come with me. You will be my last one." Suddenly, the door opened, and I bolted out of the room, screaming for my dad. He was a light sleeper, and when I burst into his room, he jumped out of bed in a panic. All I could say was, "Mara, the window." You know how people vanish when someone else comes? The same happened to me. I caught a glimpse of Mara leaving. I saw her in the distance, disappearing into the shadows beyond a house as the faint glow of lights passed over her. But my dad didn't see her. He checked the window, but Mara was gone. The next morning, I woke up to see police cars parked outside Mara's house. They were murmuring that the police had found something horrific inside her home. I was grateful to be alive. They had found innocent lives, 4 children's bodies buried in her backyard. With each body, she had buried a black rose, as if part of some dark ritual. And I might have been the last one. To this day, I wake up at night drenched in sweat, terrified that Mara is standing near my bed, tilting her head to the left with that same malicious smile, whispering, "You will come with me." Strange Grinch toy. Ethan had always been fascinated by the Grinch. His house was filled with Grinch memorabilia, from posters to collectibles. He viewed the Grinch as a misunderstood genius, and his collection was a tribute to this eccentric character. One day, while wandering through a flea market, Ethan stumbled upon an old, dusty Grinch toy. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its fur was matted and patchy, its grin unnaturally wide, and its eyes impossibly deep. When Ethan picked it up, it was warm. Not warm as if it had been sitting in the sun, but warm as if it were alive. His chest tightened, and he reassured himself it was just excitement. Ethan asked the seller for the price, but the man didn't even look at him. He muttered, "Take it, it's free," and told him to leave. Ethan placed the toy on the shelf in the center of his Grinch collection. As he stared at it, a creeping sensation ran down his spine, as if it were staring back. That's when things started to go wrong. The presence of the toy made him uneasy, and Ethan began hearing whispers in his house. As the days went by, every time he passed a mirror, his reflection became distorted. Sometimes his face would morph into a grotesque Grinch-like grin. Before it returned to normal, the decorations around his house seemed different. The Grinch figurines on his shelf appeared to change. When Ethan wasn't paying attention, their grins thinned, their eyes deepened. The whispers grew louder, and everything felt stranger. And then the dreams began to haunt him. In his dreams, Ethan saw him every night, tormented by a taller version of the Grinch. It had patchy green fur, a jagged, wide grin, and eyes glowing with malice. The Grinch watched Ethan from the foot of his bed, whispering things Ethan couldn't understand, but one phrase stuck with him.
"Come with me."
Ethan woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His obsession with the Grinch now seemed to control him. That's when Ethan began digging. He needed answers and spent days researching, scouring obscure forums and books dedicated to Christmas folklore. Then Ethan stumbled upon an old legend, a cursed Grinch toy mentioned in a book. According to folklore, the toy was not just a collectible but a trap. It fed on its owner's obsession, gradually transforming them into the very thing they admired most. Something inside Ethan didn't want to believe it, but he tried to get rid of the toy and threw it in the trash. That night, Ethan saw images of the Grinch everywhere, even hearing its voice in his head. The whispers were no longer vague but became clearer.
"Let me in,"
Or,
"You are part of me now."
but the next morning, it was back on the shelf. Ethan tried burning it, but the toy reappeared, its grin even wider. Each failed attempt to destroy it only deepened his fear and obsession. Ethan lost his mind on Christmas Eve. That was the last time he truly saw himself. This time, however, it wasn't Ethan in the mirror, it was the Grinch. Then it morphed back into his face, but it was stitched at the edges. His body trembled as he began to feel something changing inside him. Ethan screamed and punched the mirror. That was when he realized he was no longer just seeing the Grinch. He was becoming the Grinch. In a moment of madness, Ethan stood in the bathroom, staring into the mirror with a knife in his hand, blood dripping from his cheek. Now, Ethan's face bled from the wound as he carved the grin deeper. His obsession had pushed him beyond the limits of sanity. When he woke up, he was in a psychiatric hospital, surrounded by doctors and nurses who deemed him dangerous. He had harmed himself. They couldn't comprehend the curse that had consumed him. His neighbors had brought him there due to his madness. They mocked him, calling him Grinch, not realizing that what Ethan saw was real. Every night, Ethan would still see it, the Grinch, standing in the dark corner of his room, flashing a sinister grin. The insatiable craving at Voodoo Donuts. A cold winter night, when the air in their quiet little town grew heavy and horrifying. Sarah was working the night shift at Voodoo Donuts, a place that always smelled of sugar and spice. But that night, the sweetness seemed suffocated. The shop felt oppressively heavy. The doorbell jingled violently as it swung open. Big Joe, a regular customer, a man with a massive frame, usually outdone only by his cheerful demeanor, had been acting differently lately. A giant donut eating contest, meant for thrill seekers, had become a nightly ritual. He'd always ask about it, wondering if anyone had completed it in under 80 seconds. But that night, he didn't just come to eat donuts. He barged in, slamming the door so hard it banged against the wall, startling everyone. He strode straight to the counter where she stood, speaking in a gruff voice.
Tonight is the night of feasts.
She shuddered at the way he spoke, as if he wasn't really talking to her but to something behind her. Sarah hesitantly slid a tray of giant donuts across the counter. Joe grabbed it with trembling hands, his lips twitching into a deranged smile. Joe sat in his usual spot, closing his eyes and muttering unintelligibly, his large hands hovering over the tray of donuts. Without warning, he began devouring them. His movements were frantic, each bite seemingly adding to the bizarre intensity of his performance. Sarah watched from behind the counter, her unease growing stronger. Joe suddenly stood up, overturning the table. Donuts spilled onto the floor, but he didn't seem to notice. He started speaking in a strange language. From behind the counter, Sarah instinctively reached for her phone. Before she could dial, Joe grabbed a kitchen knife from the prep station nearby. Joe pointed the knife at the room, his wild eyes scanning the terrified customers.
Eat, eat.
He lunged at a young man, pressing the knife to his throat. He held him tightly, the man sobbing as Joe picked up a donut and shoved it into his mouth. Sarah spotted an old fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. She grabbed it tightly, stepping back into the chaos. As Joe raised the knife to strike, she stealthily lunged forward, swinging the fire extinguisher with all her might. It hit Joe's head with a horrifying thud. He staggered, dropping the knife, but didn't fall. Joe turned to face her, a low growl emanating from his throat. His eyes, full of rage, locked onto Sarah. Joe staggered toward her.
You don't understand. I am the chosen one. The feast never ends.
He picked up a donut that had fallen on the floor and shoved it into his mouth. As he ate, his breathing grew erratic. His face turned pale, sweat streaming down his forehead. Suddenly, something caught. He clutched at his chest. His massive body trembled, then collapsed to the floor with a loud thud. Silence enveloped the room. Sarah dropped the fire extinguisher. She cautiously approached Joe's motionless body, her breath ragged as she checked for a pulse. There was none. Police cars and ambulances stood outside the shop. She sat in the back of the ambulance, a blanket wrapped around her. Sarah couldn't escape the image, the final moments of Joe, his madness, and the obsession with a challenge that had led to his demise. Headless bus passenger. Late at night, the university campus was eerily quiet and shrouded in darkness. Calla hurried toward the campus bus stop after a long evening of studying. The long, empty street was lit by only a few dim streetlights. There was only one bus left at the stop, its headlights cutting through. The cold, misty air. She boarded the bus, her eyes briefly glancing at the driver, a man well into his years, his face lined with deep wrinkles and dark, unreadable eyes. Calla sat in the middle of the bus, trying to relax, but she suddenly sensed something strange. Through the rearview mirror, she realized the driver was staring at her intently. His eyes never left her, as if he was searching for something on her face. After a few minutes, she began to feel something was wrong. The route they were taking was unfamiliar. Instead of heading toward her dormitory, they were drifting into a desolate area, where thick darkness swallowed everything. She leaned over, peering out the window, looking around in growing confusion. Calla turned to remind the driver about her destination, but he didn't respond. His eyes were no longer on the mirror, but fixed straight ahead. He pressed on the gas, speeding up, ignoring the narrow, winding roads. Calla's fear surged. She raised her voice.
This isn't the way to my dorm.
But the driver didn't hear, or didn't care. His face had gone pale, as though he was terrified of something unseen. Suddenly, the bus swayed, and vague shapes began to materialize outside the windows. At first, they were shadows of people standing by the roadside. Then they became clearer faces with empty eyes, mouths wide open as if screaming in silent agony. They stood there, watching like bloodthirsty specters. Calla curled up, trembling, too afraid to look at those ghostly figures for long. She felt like screaming. After what felt like an eternity, the bus finally slowed down. The familiar sight of the dormitory building appeared ahead, and she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Without wasting time, she grabbed her backpack and hurried off the bus. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she heard the driver's voice for the first time that night. His voice was low, trembling, and filled with an urgency that sent chills down her spine. The driver's words were brief, but they hit Calla hard.
"Wait!"
His voice was tense. The driver told her that when he looked in the mirror earlier, he didn't see her head, only a headless body sitting where she was. He had been driving in circles, trying to shake off the spirit he believed had latched onto her. He couldn't hear her when she spoke because, in his eyes, she had already disappeared. He then warned Calla,
"When you get to your room, take off your clothes and burn them immediately."
Calla stood still, the weight of the driver's words pressing down on her. Staggering, Calla made her way into the dorm building, her mind still spinning. She fumbled with her key at the door, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Once inside, Calla rushed to her roommate's bed, shaking her awake. Her roommate listened, wide-eyed, as Calla explained what had happened. Without hesitation, Calla frantically began taking off her clothes, her movements hurried and desperate. She gathered them into a pile, staring at them as her mind replayed the driver's warning. With trembling hands, Calla picked up the clothes and went to the bathroom. She struck a match and dropped it onto the pile of fabric. The flames quickly consumed the clothes. But had it really ended? She returned to her room, exhausted, lying down on her bed, but unable to shake off the lingering terror. The room was silent. Only the sound of her and her roommate's breathing filled the space. The next morning, sunlight poured in, as if to dispel the previous night's fear, but unease still clung to her. She stood before the mirror, seeing herself clearly. Her head, her eyes, and her entire body, but her gaze was far from peaceful. She couldn't erase from her mind the image the driver described the moment when he didn't see her head in the mirror. The darkness from the night before still lingered in her thoughts, as if waiting for a moment of weakness to return. She knew her life would never be the same. The haunting memory of being headless and the spirit the driver had tried to divert would forever follow her, reminding her that terrifying things exist right next to us in the most unexpected moments. Abandoned house invaded. Behind my house, there is a large but old and decaying building. It no longer resembles a home. It now looks more like an abandoned house. It has been vacant for decades, or so my parents said. But every time I passed by, I would unmistakably hear the sound of electricity crackling from inside. It made no sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, one day I decided to investigate. I asked my friend Tim to come with me after school. He agreed, though we both felt a tense, underlying dread as we stood in front of the house, a bad premonition hanging in the air. As soon as we pushed the door open, it creaked on its rusty hinges, filling the silence. Inside, the air was thick with an unbearable stench, a mix of mold and rot. Scattered across the floor were piles of old dog food, and the foul odor hit us in waves. We carefully stepped through the strange debris and noticed something odd. The floor was littered with nails, hundreds of them, along with animal traps, as if someone had deliberately tried to prevent people from walking through the house. We tiptoed through, avoiding the nails, our curiosity growing stronger with each step. Then we heard the sound of an electric charge, followed by a scream of pain from upstairs. It sent a shiver down my spine, We should have turned back, but our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to climb the stairs. On the second floor, the noise led us to a closed door. From behind it, we heard a man's voice muttering something strange, as if giving commands. What was happening on the other side? Summoning our last bit of courage, we tiptoed up the stairs and peeked inside. The sight was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. It looked like someone had been chained up. 2 people sat on the floor, appearing to be a couple who had been captured and imprisoned. Their eyes were wide open, filled with terror. A man stood before them, holding a stun gun, threatening them to follow his commands. For a moment, the room fell silent as the 2 people stared at us in disbelief. Their eyes pleaded for help, silently begging for mercy. Then their voices broke with desperation, sobbing and pleading not to be harmed. The man panicked, shouting at them to be quiet while violently beating them with the stun gun. But they continued screaming, their cries echoing through every corner of the room. Tim froze, paralyzed with fear, and accidentally knocked over a piece of wood, creating a loud noise. That was when the man noticed us. The man turned toward us, his eyes filled with rage. Without hesitation, he grabbed the stun gun and charged at us. We bolted down the stairs, but Tim wasn't fast enough. His screams echoed down the hallway as I heard the crackling of the stun gun. I didn't stop running until I was outside, my heart pounding in my chest. I called the police, barely able to get the words out, but I knew I couldn't leave Tim behind. I ran back into the house, trying to stay as quiet as possible, recalling the self-defense lessons I had learned at school. The door to the room was still open, and I peeked in. My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man was putting a collar around Tim's neck, his hands already bound tightly. I couldn't just stand there and watch my friend and these innocent people suffer like this. Rage surged through me, and I charged at the man, kicking him with all the strength I had. He staggered and fell, dropping the stun gun. I grabbed it, threatening him. Moments later, the police arrived and pulled me away from him. As the police began to untie the captives, they discovered something even more horrifying. Their feet had been glued to the floor with industrial adhesive. I was horrified that the man had gone to such lengths. Finally, the rescue team arrived, and the hostages were freed, though their condition was dire. They had been beaten, starved, and fed animal food. When the police interrogated the man, his chilling response was that he wanted to keep humans as pets. In the end, he was arrested and taken to prison. None of us ever spoke about that day again. This is a warning from what I witnessed. If you ever come across an abandoned house, no matter how strong your urge to explore, resist it. Stay away, because no one can guarantee you will make it out alive. Haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there, haunting delivery trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, A notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over. Late shift and creepy encounter. It is now 9:30 p.m., and I am still here, stuck in the dim light of the computer screen, the only source of light in a dark, empty office. I glance at the clock, sighing in frustration. I have worked here as a software engineer for 2 years, and nights like these have become all too familiar. I hope to leave soon, but I am still waiting for one last file. I push back from my desk, rubbing my tired eyes. The building is silent, too silent. I stand up, deciding to grab a cup of coffee from the cafeteria to stay awake. As I walk through the open office space, I enjoy the quiet, a calm after the daily chaos of the workday. The sound of the coffee maker buzzing is a small comfort as I pour myself a cup. An idea sparks in my mind, and with a mischievous smile, I head to the security room. After working long hours, I have a master key card that opens every door in the building. I swipe the card and step inside, greeted by a wall of screens, each showing a different part of the building. I sit down, curious, and start scrolling through the camera feeds. It's strange to see the empty squares, the vacant hallways making the passage of time more intriguing. Then, something unusual catches my eye. The elevator doors on the ground floor open, and a woman in a green dress steps out. I have never seen her before, and I am sure she doesn't work here. I track them on the camera, watching as they hold hands walking down the hallway. I lean back in my chair, stunned. Mr. Newman, my boss who left early for a celebration, has returned here in the middle of the night with another woman. I switch to other camera feeds, waiting for them to leave, and I return to his office feed feeling something is off about their expressions. I have a bad feeling. The door opens, and the woman rushes out, clearly upset. Mr. Newman follows, trying to reassure her. After a tense exchange, they head towards the cafeteria. I quickly switch to the cafeteria camera, and sure enough, they enter, sitting at a table. Mr. Newman stands up and sneaks into the kitchen area, leaving her alone. I switch to the kitchen feed, and what I see chills my blood. He is holding a knife, his expression tense, eyes searching for something. My mind races, and before I know it, I rush to the cafeteria. I approach the woman from behind, placing a hand over her mouth before she can scream. "I'm here to help," I whisper. "You need to leave. He's going to hurt you." She looks at me, confused yet scared, and nods. We turn to leave, but Mr. Newman appears in the doorway, blocking our exit, knife firmly in hand. He sneers, asking where we think we're going. I step forward, trying to shield her. He laughs, a cruel sound echoing down the hallway mockingly, saying that if so, he'll make sure we both disappear. I feel the woman beside me tense up, his expression shifting as his eyes narrow when he lunges forward, the knife aimed directly at me. I defended, but the impact was still so brutal that the blade stabbed into my hand. The pain seemed to painfully spread throughout my body. I staggered back, gritting my teeth against the intense pain of his madness. He starts shifting his focus to her, cornering her against the wall, and he begins to wildly raise the knife in anger. Desperation drives me, and I grab a nearby chair, swinging it with the last of my strength. The heavy metal frame strikes his head, causing him to stagger back. Blood flows from the cut on his forehead as he crashes to the floor, dazed for a moment. The woman screams, but she quickly pulls out her phone, her hand shaking as she calls the police. I fell against the wall, clutching my arms, my vision blurring as I struggled to stay conscious. He hisses, wiping blood from his face, saying that what I've caused will have consequences because I've ruined all his plans. He tries to stand up, but he staggers, his breathing becoming rapid and angry. The woman steps back, her voice trembling as she speaks into the phone, reporting our location. She stares down at him, a mix of fear and anger on her face. He looks up, eyes wild, and lunges toward her, but I try to grab his ankle, pulling him down. I strain to pull painfully. I shout, my voice hoarse, "Enough! It's over. You won't get away with this." The sound of approaching sirens fills the air, their wails piercing the silence. The police are on their way. Newman's face pales as he realizes time is running out. He kicks my hand in a desperate attempt to escape. The police burst into the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They find us in the hallway, and within moments, Newman is handcuffed, his expression one of utter defeat as they lead him away. I was loaded onto a stretcher. The paramedics stabilized my arms while the woman stood next to me, her face a mixture of relief and remorse. The next morning, I sit in a room at the police station, an officer seated across the table, looking at me seriously. He recounts the details they have uncovered. Newman had been seeing the woman at the scene, promising to be with her. But when she found out he was married, she threatened to expose him. Panicked and desperate to protect himself, he planned to eliminate her, believing no one would be there to witness his crime. He brought her to the office, hoping to use the quiet space to his advantage. What he didn't anticipate was my presence, my late-night habits, and my caution leading me to the security room. The officer continues to explain that Newman's wife filed for divorce, her anger and disgust evident when she learned the truth. The woman, unaware of his marital status until that night, expresses deep remorse, shaken that she almost lost her life. I lay on the hospital bed, my hand bandaged. The events of that night replayed in my mind, each moment vivid and unsettling. I stumbled upon a dark secret, and in doing so, I saved a life, narrowly escaping death. I know that night will haunt me for a long time, a reminder of how easily darkness can hide behind familiar faces. But as I prepare to leave the hospital, I feel a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that sometimes, even in the quietest corners of life, we can find ourselves amidst the unimaginable. The crazy man blocked the truck. It was a torrential, rainy day. After finishing a long, exhausting day at work, I drove my old, large truck back home. The windshield wipers battled against the pouring rain, moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The radio crackled faintly, almost drowned out by the sound of rain pounding on the truck's metal body. The road ahead was nearly deserted, a winding path through a remote forest. Tall, ominous trees loomed on both sides, their branches reaching out like twisted, skeletal hands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white from the cold. My eyes were focused on the road, but my gaze was weary, longing to be home soon. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. Finding it strange, I drove a short distance further and then pulled over to the side of the road to rest for a moment. From a distance, there was that figure again. The silhouette was of a man, his hair disheveled and soaked by the rain. He stood motionless, his head slightly tilted to one side, staring straight at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His clothes were tattered and drenched, clinging to his gaunt frame. In his hand, he held something long, thin, and menacing under the headlights. My heart raced as I stared at the man, an instinctual sense of danger warning me. The man did not move, did not blink, just stood there, staring. My breath fogged up the window as I pondered what to do, making his already ominous figure appear even more distorted and terrifying. But before I could act, the man suddenly lunged forward, slamming his hand on the hood of the truck. The force of the impact made me jump out of my seat, my heart pounding. The man's face was now just inches from the windshield. His eyes were wild and bloodshot. I recoiled in horror as I realized the object in his hand was a long, sharp needle, attached to a syringe filled with a murky yellow liquid. The man's mouth curled into a deranged smile, revealing yellowed and cracked teeth. He lifted the needle, tapping it lightly with his finger as if preparing to use it. He fumbled with the door lock, as if deliberately trying to frighten me. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, darkening the scene with a rising sense of dread. The man moved with terrifying speed. He lunged at the side door, yanking it open with astonishing strength. I could barely think, and there was no time to react before the man lunged at me. The syringe was raised, aimed straight at my neck. I struggled, adrenaline surging through my veins as I tried to push the man away. But his grip was like iron, his strength fueled by madness. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was this man? What did he want? Why was he doing this? The questions swirled in my head, but there were no answers, only a desperate need to survive. The man giggled, a high-pitched, maniacal sound. The needle inched closer. I twisted and turned, trying to evade it, but the man was relentless. In one final desperate move, I surged with a burst of life. I managed to grab the man's wrist. We wrestled, fighting for control. The man's eyes were wide and wild. His foul breath hit my face in a horrific gust. With gritted teeth, I mustered all my remaining strength and shoved the man back with a powerful force, sending him tumbling backward. The syringe fell to the ground, the needle shattering upon impact, the liquid inside spilling out and mixing with the rain. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing heavily, tense with fear. I watched as the man staggered to his feet. He let out a frustrated scream, his voice echoing through the empty forest. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I quickly shifted the truck into gear and hit the gas, the truck speeding away from the deranged man. Exhausted and shaken from the struggle, I drove in silence, quickly contacting the police about the incident and heading straight to the hospital. The man's wild eyes, his maniacal grin, the syringe filled with that strange liquid, they all haunted my mind. After the police investigated, they finally apprehended him and placed him in custody for psychiatric treatment. It turned out he wasn't just targeting me. He was after others as well, all as part of the twisted pleasure of a deranged mind. Highway Trapmaker. It had been a long day of driving for me. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearly 9 p.m. I stopped at a small gas station, dimly lit, filled up the tank, and bought an energy drink from the store. The cool night air brushed against my face as I stretched before climbing back into the truck. With a 3-hour drive ahead, I settled into the seat, ready for the journey. The open road stretched out before me, desolate, bathed in the soft glow of the headlights. My only companion was the music playing through the cabin. I drifted a bit, feeling slightly drowsy, and quickly focused back on the road, allowing my mind to wander as I sipped my drink, hoping it would help keep me awake. Around 11 p.m., a sudden crackle pulled me from my drowsiness. The sound came from the radio I had on the trucker channel. With everything so quiet, the noise startled me. Through the static, I thought I heard a voice, faint and unclear. The words were difficult to make out, but it sounded like hello or help. My heart raced a little faster as I glanced around, looking into the darkness behind the headlights, but there were no other vehicles in sight. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button, my voice trembling as I asked, "Is anyone out there? Do you need help?" I waited, listening to the static fill the silence, but there was no response. Just as I was about to release the button, my headlights caught something ahead on the road. I slowed the truck down, coming to a stop as I saw a large rig parked in the middle of the road, motionless. It was strange. There were no signs of anyone around, no lights, nothing at all. I pulled over to the side and climbed out, the chill of the night air making me shiver. As I approached the rig, I called out, my voice breaking the strange silence. "Hello? Is anyone there?" But my voice was swallowed by the emptiness around me. I climbed into the open door of the truck and looked inside. My heart sank as I realized it was empty. There was no one inside. The driver's seat vacant, but a jacket hung over the passenger seat, a half-finished cup of coffee in the holder. The radio was silent now, but a faint static still lingered in the air. It was as if the driver had simply vanished. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no clues as to where they had gone. A shiver ran down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave this place, a growing sense of unease gnawing at me. I stepped away from the rig, scanning my surroundings, my eyes sweeping over the dark fields on either side of the road. The tall grass swayed, casting eerie shadows that shifted under the moonlight. Then something peculiar caught my eye, a faded photo pinned to the dashboard. I squinted in the dim light, leaning in for a closer look. It was a family photo, the kind you might get at a cheap roadside stand. A man stood with his wife and daughter, smiling, carefree. I didn't recognize the man, but there was something in his expression that filled me with a sense of sadness. I stepped back, my gaze lingering on the photo as a chill ran down my spine. That's when I realized this truck wasn't just abandoned. Perhaps it was a trap, deliberately left here to lure someone, anyone, into this desolate stretch of road. A twig snapped behind me, the sudden noise cutting through the night like a knife. My instincts kicked in, and I whipped around just in time to see a figure emerging from the darkness, their face obscured. My heart raced as I took a step back, my mind scrambling for a plan. I was alone, isolated, surrounded only by trees and an empty highway. I couldn't run. He would catch me in seconds. Thinking quickly, I scrambled back into the empty truck, my hands shaking as I rummaged through the cabin. I found a wrench on the floor and gripped it tightly, crouching down inside the truck, preparing myself as I listened for approaching footsteps. The figure approached the open door, his face finally illuminated by the moonlight. He was grinning widely, a cold, threatening smile that made me shudder, and I realized with horrifying clarity that he had done this before. He stepped closer, moving slowly and deliberately, savoring the fear in my eyes. But I wouldn't go down without a fight. I charged at him, swinging the wrench with all my might, catching him off guard. We stumbled out of the truck, struggling on the ground. The night came alive with the sounds of our scuffle, grunts and the scrape of shoes on gravel. He was stronger than I was, but desperation fueled me, making me fight harder, faster. I tried to break free, staggering to my feet as he pulled back, clutching his shoulder. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both of us breathing heavily, the tension thick and suffocating. I gripped the wrench tightly, ready, but he hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. I seized on his hesitation, advancing with the wrench raised. He stepped back, the threat in his eyes replaced with something else, perhaps fear. He turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness, the sound of his footsteps fading until there was nothing but silence. I climbed back into my truck, locking the doors as I settled into the seat, my hands still trembling from what had just happened. I reached for the radio, my voice barely above a whisper as I called for help, my words spilling out in a rush. I told them everything: the abandoned truck, the photo, the man who attacked me. They assured me that help was on the way, that the police would be there soon. The flashing lights of the police car cut through the night, a relief after feeling like the darkness stretched on forever. I watched as the officers investigated the scene, their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. One of the officers approached me, his expression grim as he recounted what they had found. The truck belonged to a man reported missing weeks ago. A man with a family, a wife and young daughter. They suspected foul play, but there was currently no sign of him. The man, they found footprints leading into the woods, but they ended abruptly, as if he had vanished into thin air. It was as if the darkness itself had swallowed him, leaving nothing but an unsettling silence. The sun began to rise as I sat in the truck. The police had temporarily concluded their investigation, saying they would keep me updated, that they would do everything they could to find the missing man and bring the attacker to justice. I took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I didn't know what awaited me ahead, but I knew one thing: I had survived that night and escaped the trap he had set. A few days later, I was called to the police station to discuss the investigation. A policeman sat across from me, his eyes serious as he flipped through a thick stack of papers. He explains that they have identified both the attacker and the missing man, piecing together the details of a dark plot. The attacker, a vagrant with a violent history, was responsible for a series of disappearances along this stretch of highway. He preyed on both truckers and tourists, luring them in with abandoned cars, like the one I found. using them as bait to satisfy his twisted sense of control. The man in the photo is one of his victims. But this time, the attacker did not escape. After he ran away from me that night, he made a mistake, leaving behind clues that led the police to him. They find him hiding in an old, dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of town, the walls covered with memorabilia stolen from his victims. The officer who showed me the photo from the abandoned truck, now sealed in a plastic evidence bag, told me they would notify the victim's family. I stared at the photo, feeling a mixture of relief and bitterness, knowing that this monster would no longer haunt the highway, no longer tear apart the lives of innocent people. Horrible night train ride. It was a cold autumn evening, and the train station was nearly deserted. The dim streetlights flickered in the distance as I hurried through the empty streets. I had walked for 30 minutes from my university and was about to catch the 9 p.m. train. I ran to the platform just in time as the train stopped in front of me. I stepped inside, glancing at the empty train cars. It was always quiet at this hour of the night, with only a few passengers. I found an empty seat by the window and sat down. I opened my notebook to review my lecture notes. The train gently rumbled as it pulled away from the station. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks was soothing, almost enough to drown out the unease gnawing at me. I looked around the train car and was surprised to see another passenger. A girl was sitting a few rows away, her head bowed, her face hidden by long, dark hair. I hadn't noticed her when I first boarded. She didn't move, just sat there, completely still. Something about her posture made me uneasy. She was hunched over as if staring intently at something at her feet, but I couldn't see what. I tried to focus on my notes, but my mind kept drifting back to her. She had been sitting still for a long time. The longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. Suddenly, I heard a faint rustling sound. I looked up. She was no longer in her seat. Now she was right in front of me. I found it strange because I hadn't seen her move at all. A moment ago, she had been several rows away, and now here she was, her pale face directly in front of me. Her skin was almost ghostly white, and her eyes were wide, black, and empty, staring at me without blinking. Then she smiled, a smile that made me jump in fear. She began to speak, her voice soft, whispery, and strange. She greeted me and introduced herself as Jan. She then asked for my name. For a moment, my throat went dry, and I couldn't speak. I hesitated, stammering my name. Her smile grew wider, and she tilted her head slightly as if studying me.
Nice to meet you, T.
Her eyes never blinked, just stared straight into me. I felt a bit uncomfortable, but I tried to remain calm. I told myself she was just a strange student, maybe someone a little socially awkward. After an awkward silence, she finally spoke. She asked me if I had noticed anything strange and why this train was so empty. Then, with a curious tone, she asked if I had heard the rumors. My heart skipped a beat. She leaned closer, whispering,
People have gone missing on this train. Everyone at school knows about it. That's why I usually don't take this train. But tonight, I had no choice.
Her words sent chills down my spine. I hadn't heard any rumors, but the way she said it, the intensity in her eyes, it gave me goosebumps. I forced a smile, trying to break the tension. I had never heard that story before. I glanced around the empty train car. The train kept moving, the world outside darkening. Suddenly, Jan's expression changed. She froze, her eyes wide as she whispered, trembling, asking if I could hear something. I frowned, straining my ears to listen. I listened harder, but all I could hear was the sound of the train on the tracks and the engine. Her eyes were fixed on the window, her face creased with fear.
It's getting louder,
she said.
Listen carefully.
I just wanted to ignore her, to dismiss whatever she was saying. Then, I saw it. A shadowy figure, flickering in and out of view, running alongside the train, its limbs long and distorted. It moved unnaturally fast. I asked what it was, but she didn't answer, her face pale with fear. She whispered,
"It's coming."
The train shook. The lights flickered for a moment. I jumped, gripping the edge of my seat. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, Jan was gone. I blinked, my mind reeling. How could she have disappeared like that? I stood up, looking around the car, but there was no sign of her. The train began to slow down. The door slid open, and a thick darkness enveloped me. I couldn't see anything. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my breath visible in the cold air. And then I felt it, a cold hand gripping my shoulder. Horrible night train ride. From behind, I felt an icy hand gripping tightly on my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the cold fingers tightened. Slowly, I turned my head, but there was no one there. I staggered back out of the compartment, my body shaking as I looked around frantically. The train was still there, silent and motionless on the tracks. I don't know where I am. The only light comes from the flickering light of the train window. I started walking along the length of the train, hoping to find some clue about where we had stopped. My footsteps crunched heavily on the gravel. Then, I heard a faint rustling noise behind me. Instinct told me to run, but I didn't know where to go. My only option was to go back inside. I couldn't stay out here, but the thought of stepping back into that strange train filled me with fear. Still, I had no other choice. Stepping inside, the air felt heavier, more stifling than before. The dim lights flickered weakly, casting shadows over the empty seats. In the distance, near the end of the train car, there was a figure sitting motionless, head bowed, just like the girl Jan I had met. I knew I shouldn't approach, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward her. I called out, my voice trembling, "Jan?" I stopped a few feet away, staring at the figure. Her hair hung limply over her face, wet and dripping, as if she had just emerged from a pool of water. I stepped closer, intending to touch her, calling Jan again. She didn't respond. Then, she finally moved. She slowly turned her head toward me, her movements unnaturally stiff, jerking like a robot. My breath caught in my throat as her face came into view. Her eyes, once dark and intense, were now completely empty, like black voids staring right through me. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips curled into that same strange smile as before. There was a faint hissing sound, perhaps coming from her. Before I could react, she stood up, her body rising off the ground, floating. Her feet no longer touched the floor. She hovered just above it, her long hair flowing in the air. I was frozen in place, horrified as Jan's form began to change, her body stretching and distorting. It was something I had never seen in real life. A voice echoed through the train car, coming from everywhere, surrounding me.
Why did you come back? Why are you here?
My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. I needed to get out and leave. But when I turned to run, I felt something cold and invisible pressing against my chest. I moved like a puppet, being forced back into the seat. The lights flickered violently, casting wild, shaking shadows as if the train had come alive. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Silence filled the air. I looked up, and there was Jan, floating, her long, translucent fingers reaching toward my face. She told me to come with her, that I could never leave. The cold radiated from her, seeping into my bones, freezing me. Her fingers brushed against my skin, and in that moment, I was no longer on the train. I was floating in an empty void, with nothing but the sound of my own panicked breathing. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. I was trapped. Then, from the darkness, I saw them other figures, floating, drifting. Their forms were distorted, their faces obscured, and their eyes were empty. I couldn't breathe. Was this what happened to the missing passengers? Had they been brought here, into this void, to become part of this nightmare? And was I next? Suddenly, with a violent jerk, I was thrown back into reality. I was in my seat again, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. Jan was gone. The train began to slow down, the familiar sound of the tracks returning. Finally, the train stopped at the station. The doors slid open, revealing an empty platform bathed in dim, flickering light. I staggered off the train, my legs weak and unsteady after what had happened. The doors closed, and as I turned back to look, the train began to move again, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't know if it was truly over. I stood there for a long time, staring into the void where the train had vanished.
The Window Stalker.
It all started that day, when I was just a child, too young to fully comprehend the horror that was about to unfold. Our home was always cozy, with large windows in the living room that overlooked the beautiful garden outside. I was sitting on the couch with my back to the window, fully immersed in my favorite TV show. My mother was in the kitchen, doing her usual chores, but then something caught my attention. In the reflection of the TV screen, I saw the silhouette of a man. I could see him through the glass, standing motionless in the garden behind me. I thought it was probably my dad, so I didn't turn around. I called out, "Horror story about a truck driver." As soon as I said that, I saw my mom freeze and then rush into the living room. When my mom saw the figure standing outside the window, her face went blank. I had never seen her look so terrified. I turned around. There he was, a stranger, a scruffy man with wild eyes, just standing there staring at us with a sick, twisted grin. He didn't seem to care that he had been spotted. He just smiled wider, almost enjoying the fear he was causing in my mother and me. Without hesitation, my mom yelled, threatening to call the police if he came closer, but I could sense her fear. And then, he said something that still chills me to this day. He growled through the glass with a menacing voice, "If you touch that phone, I'll break this window, and neither of you will be safe." My mom hesitated, torn between calling for help and protecting me, unsure of what to do next. His eyes flared with anger as he fumbled with something inside his coat. And then, in the blink of an eye, he lunged toward the back door. I heard him pounding on it, frantically rattling the doorknob. Thank God it was locked. His frustration turned into rage. He screamed, demanding to be let in, threatening that if he got inside, he wouldn't spare us. I was too young to fully grasp the danger we were in. My mom grabbed me, pulling me off the couch, and we ran upstairs. We didn't stop until we reached the top floor, and that's when I saw my uncle, my mom's younger brother. My uncle was standing in the hallway, headphones on, completely unaware of the chaos downstairs. He was a big, muscular man, the kind you wouldn't want to mess with. He used to compete in boxing matches and had won several trophies. My uncle, confused, asked, "What's going on?" as my mom frantically explained. And just as she finished, we heard the man's voice again, coming from downstairs. His voice echoed through the house, saying, "The boogeyman is coming to get you." Those words were etched into my memory. My uncle heard him and told us to lock ourselves in the bathroom and call the police. My mom pulled me into the bathroom, locked the door as instructed, and called 911. I could hear the man downstairs, his voice growing more erratic. Then, The sound of glass shattering echoed throughout the house. My mom and I held our breath, frozen in fear, waiting for what felt like an eternity for something to happen. We waited and prayed that it was over. Footsteps echoed up the stairs. We braced ourselves, fearing the worst. My uncle slowly stepped out of his hiding spot, waiting for the perfect moment to tackle the man, relying on his sharp reflexes as a seasoned boxer. He didn't hold back and swiftly disarmed the man. My uncle saved us. The door swung open, and the police arrived just in time, securing the situation. They arrested the man and informed us that he was a dangerous criminal they had been hunting for some time. That day changed everything. My mom never felt comfortable being alone again and always looked over her shoulder at the windows. If it hadn't been for my uncle, I don't know what would have happened. I still shudder when I think about it. Mysterious invitation in the basement. The warm afternoon sun spread across the school campus as the students left for the day. I remember it like it was yesterday. Everything seemed normal, but there was something different about that week. That was the week Justin arrived. He was a new student, showing up in the middle of the semester without warning. He was quiet, maybe a little strange, but friendly enough. He sat next to me in class because there happened to be an empty seat, and soon enough, we started talking. Justin always seemed distant, like he was hiding something and rarely talked about himself. He just said he had recently moved to our town. There was something odd about him, but I brushed it aside. I thought everyone had their quirks. A few weeks later, he invited me over to his house. I was a bit surprised by this. He told me to come around 7 p.m. I wasn't particularly excited, but I agreed. After all, he was new to town, and I thought he could use a friend. That night, I took a bus to his neighborhood and started walking to find Justin's house. His home was in a rundown area. The houses were small, and the streets were eerily quiet. The porch light was off when I arrived, and the windows were dark. I texted Justin to let him know I was there. After a minute with no reply, I moved closer to the front door. It was unlocked. I paused for a moment, then pushed the door open. Inside, it was almost pitch black. The house was silent, except for a faint noise coming from somewhere deep inside. I stood at the entrance, calling out for Justin, but there was no answer. My phone buzzed, and finally, he responded, "Come in. I'm in the basement." I went down the basement stairs. The sound of a TV or video game echoed from the basement. The basement door was slightly ajar, and the noise grew louder as I approached. I figured Justin was playing something. The basement was darker than the rest of the house, with just a faint light flickering. As I descended, the sounds of gunfire and explosions became clearer, but something felt wrong. I called out to Justin again, but the only answer I got was the echo of my own voice. At the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. It was pitch black, except for the flicker of a TV somewhere in the distance. I moved forward, inching through the darkness, toward the faint light. I called out again, louder this time, "Justin," but still nothing. Suddenly, I felt it, a hard shove from behind. I stumbled and hit the ground face first. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I lay there for a moment, stunned. Laughter echoed through the basement. I staggered to my feet, my heart racing. I turned, trying to see who had pushed me, but the darkness swallowed everything. Then came another shove, harder this time, sending me sprawling to the floor again. The laughter started up once more. It felt like I was being toyed with. Panic hit me. My legs were trembling. Someone kicked my legs as I tried to stand, knocking me down again. I had to get out now. I sprinted toward the stairs, my feet slipping on the slick concrete floor. My heart pounded in my chest. Footsteps echoed behind me, and the laughter still rang in my ears. My hands fumbled in the dark, desperately searching for the railing. My foot caught on the bottom step, and I stumbled, but I managed to catch myself. I burst through the front door and ran. When I got home, I texted Justin, wanting to know what the hell had just happened, but he never responded. The next day at school, I expected him to show up and either laugh it off or offer an explanation. But Justin didn't say a word. He sat there, silent, avoiding my gaze. Then, one Monday, he was gone. His desk was empty, with no books or belongings. There were rumors that he had moved away, but no one seemed to care. But I did. I couldn't stop thinking about that night. In my mind, I kept replaying the moment I was shoved and the laughter that followed me. It felt like I was being hunted. I still wondered if it had been Justin or someone else down there with me. And then I remembered something I had overlooked in the chaos. When I first entered the basement, there were more footsteps than just mine. I didn't dare go back to Justin's house after that day. I'm glad I escaped that house. I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved and without knowing, but the questions I wonder still haunt me and push me to find them. I don't know if I should. Mysterious invitation in the basement. It's been weeks since Justin disappeared. Despite my best efforts to move on, my mind kept going back to that basement. The laughter, the shoves, the darkness. No matter how hard I tried to push it away, it haunted me. There was a nagging feeling inside me I needed answers. Tonight, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, and a message was sent. It seemed like spam. Hey Ken, long time no see. Just remember to stay away from it. I didn't know what the warning was about, or what I was supposed to stay away from. But my mind kept repeating, could it be Justin? I couldn't keep living with this fear. If Justin had any answers, I was going to get them tonight. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. Justin's house looked just as it had when I left it, dark and unsettling. The eerie silence of the neighborhood made me anxious. The front door was ajar, just like before. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was quiet, and my footsteps echoed through the empty space, each step sending chills down my spine. The fear I had felt weeks ago crept back in. I cautiously headed straight for the basement. The door was wide open. The stairs creaked beneath me as I descended into the pitch-black void. I gripped my phone tightly, using its light to guide me, but the beam barely cut through the suffocating darkness. The temperature dropped as I moved deeper inside. Slowly, I saw it something I had missed before. In the faint glow of my phone, I noticed strange symbols carved into the walls, jagged and confusing like runes. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my attention. I swept my phone around, and there, at the far end of the basement, I saw him, Justin. He stood still, his face pale, eyes wide, lifeless and empty, staring straight at me. My voice caught in my throat as I called his name. Justin? He didn't respond. He didn't move. Whether it was my eyes or the darkness, he seemed half visible, almost translucent in the dim light of my phone, like he wasn't even there. I cautiously moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and then the whispering began. It started small, unintelligible, but grew louder. Fear crept in. He was muttering something in a language I couldn't understand, then told me,
"You shouldn't have come back."
Suddenly, my mind was flooded with images. I wasn't in the present anymore. I was seeing something from years ago. I saw Justin standing in the basement with his strange mother. They stood around a table covered with old books and candles. Justin seemed forced into it, his face filled with fear and resignation. The candles flickered, and suddenly, Justin froze. He stared at something in the shadows. A figure slowly emerged with eyes burning like fire. The figure reached out, and in a flash, everything stopped. I was back in the present, gasping for air. I stepped back, my eyes scanning the basement. Justin's body twitched, his mouth curling into a grotesque, twisted smile as he said,
"It never left. It's been waiting for you."
I tried to move, but I couldn't. The ground beneath me trembled, and I felt invisible, icy hands pulling me down. But just as I was about to be swallowed by some unseen darkness, I saw Justin, his real face. It was different from before. He looked pitiful, as if he were trapped. He whispered faintly,
"Help me, please."
In that moment, it hit me, had Justin never left the basement? Had he been trapped here all this time? I screamed his name, Justin, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing I heard was the basement door slamming shut above me, locking us inside. Then I opened my eyes. I woke up, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. I was in my bed, in my room, with the faint light of dawn creeping through the window. It felt like hours had passed, but when I glanced at the clock, only a few minutes had gone by. I had no idea when I had fallen, asleep. For a moment, I thought it was just a nightmare, but it felt too real. It made me think about the questions I had sought answers for, but that dream made me stop. Was it a warning to keep me away from all of it? I think I will never go back there again.